Imagine if the reason you feel confused, stressed, or lost in life is not because you are missing something, but because you have never truly been alone long enough to hear your own mind clearly. Every day, the world fills your thoughts with opinions, expectations, and endless noise until you forget what your own voice sounds like. But when you step into solitude, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind slows down, hidden truths emerge, and you begin discovering parts of yourself that were buried beneath distraction. Buddhist wisdom teaches that solitude is not isolation. It is the path back to yourself. In this video, you will learn 7 powerful lessons that reveal why spending time alone can transform the way you understand your mind, your purpose, and your life. 1. In solitude, you finally hear the voice you have been drowning out. In the constant noise of modern life, it is easy to lose connection with your inner voice. Every day, the mind is flooded with conversations, opinions, social media messages, expectations from others, and endless information that demands attention. Slowly and almost invisibly, this external noise becomes louder than the quiet guidance that naturally exists within every person. Many people move through life making decisions based on what others expect, what society praises, or what the crowd is chasing, without ever pausing to ask themselves what they truly feel inside. When a person enters solitude, this situation begins to change. Without the constant interference of external voices, the mind becomes quiet enough to notice something that was always present but rarely heard. Beneath the thoughts, beneath the fears, beneath the endless mental chatter, there is a calm awareness that gently guides your understanding of life. Buddhist teachings describe this as a form of inner wisdom that becomes visible only when the mind is no longer distracted by the outside world. In solitude, the voice you have been drowning out for years begins to speak again, and often it reveals truths about your life that you could not see while surrounded by noise. 2. Solitude teaches you that you are not your thoughts. One of the most powerful realizations that appears during solitude is understanding that you are not the thoughts constantly moving through your mind. Most people believe that every thought they experience represents who they are. If the mind produces fear, they think they are a fearful person. If anger appears, they believe they are an angry person. But Buddhist wisdom explains that thoughts are simply temporary mental events. They come and go naturally, just like clouds passing through the sky. When you spend time alone and begin quietly observing your mind, you start noticing something interesting. Thoughts appear without you choosing them and disappear without you pushing them away. One moment, the mind worries about the future. The next moment, it replays the past, and soon after, it jumps to something completely different. This constant change shows that thoughts are not your true identity. Solitude helps you see this clearly. As you watch your thoughts come and go, you begin realizing that there is a deeper awareness inside you that simply observes them. This calm awareness remains steady even while thoughts continue changing. Once you understand this, your thoughts no longer control you in the same way. Instead of reacting to every thought, you begin learning how to observe them calmly and guide your mind with greater clarity. 3. Alone, you discover what you actually want, not what you were told to want. When you spend time alone, something very important begins to happen inside your mind. For the first time, you get the space to ask yourself what you truly want in life. Most people believe their goals and dreams are their own, but many of these desires were quietly shaped by the expectations of family, society, friends, or culture. From a young age, people are told what success should look like, what kind of life they should pursue, and what things they should value. Over time, these ideas become so familiar that we begin chasing them without ever questioning whether they truly belong to us. Solitude creates the distance needed to see this more clearly. When you step away from constant comparison and outside influence, the mind becomes quieter and more honest. In that quiet space, you begin noticing which desires actually come from your heart and which ones were simply learned from others. You start realizing what truly brings meaning, what genuinely excites your curiosity, and what direction feels natural for your life. Buddhism teaches that clarity about your path often appears in silence because only in solitude can the mind separate its true desires from the expectations of the world. Solitude heals what relationships cannot. There are certain wounds in life that cannot fully heal while we are still surrounded by the same noise, reactions, and emotional patterns that helped create them. Relationships are an important and meaningful part of life, but they can also become places where misunderstandings, disappointments, and emotional pain quietly accumulate over time. When a person is constantly interacting with others, the mind often remains trapped in cycles of reaction. Someone says something that reminds us of the past. We react emotionally, and before we realize it, the same pattern repeats again. In these moments, the mind rarely has the space to truly understand what it is feeling or why it reacts the way it does. Buddhist wisdom teaches that healing requires awareness, and awareness often grows best in silence. When you step away from constant interaction and spend time alone, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Without the pressure to respond, defend yourself, or explain your emotions, your mind finally has the freedom to observe what is happening inside you. You begin remembering experiences that once confused you, but now you can look at them with a calmer and more balanced perspective. Situations that once triggered anger or sadness start revealing deeper lessons about your expectations, your fears, and your attachments. Solitude creates a gentle space where emotions can surface naturally instead of being pushed down or ignored. Sometimes old sadness appears. Sometimes regret or disappointment rises into awareness. At first, this may feel uncomfortable, but Buddhist teachings explain that this is part of the healing process. When emotions are allowed to be seen clearly, without resistance, they begin losing their grip on the mind. Anger softens into understanding. Resentment slowly dissolves into acceptance. Pain that once felt overwhelming becomes something the mind can observe with compassion rather than fear. During solitude, you also begin noticing the emotional habits you developed in relationships. You may realize that you often tried to please others at the cost of your own peace, or that you expected people to understand feelings you never clearly expressed. These realizations are not meant to create blame. Instead, they create awareness. Once the mind understands its own patterns, it becomes easier to grow beyond them. Another powerful aspect of solitude is that it allows the heart to rest. When we are constantly interacting with others, our emotional energy is always moving outward. We respond, react, explain, defend, and adapt to the expectations around us. Over time, this can leave the mind feeling exhausted. Solitude turns this energy inward. Instead of trying to manage everyone else's emotions, you begin caring for your own. The mind becomes calmer, breathing becomes deeper, and the nervous system slowly returns to balance. Buddhist teachings often compare this process to a lake that has been disturbed by strong winds. When the wind finally stops, the water gradually becomes still again. As the surface calms, the lake begins reflecting the sky with perfect clarity. In the same way, when the constant movement of emotional reactions pauses during solitude, the mind slowly returns to its natural state of clarity and peace. This healing does not mean abandoning relationships or rejecting people. In fact, solitude often improves the way we connect with others later. When the mind becomes more aware of its own emotions and patterns, interactions with others become more balanced and compassionate. Instead of reacting automatically, you respond with greater patience and understanding. Instead of carrying unresolved pain into every interaction, you bring a calmer and more grounded presence. In this way, solitude becomes a quiet place, where emotional wounds begin to heal, where understanding replaces confusion, and where the mind regains the strength it needs to engage with the world in a healthier way. Sometimes, the most important healing does not happen through conversation or advice from others. Sometimes, it happens in silence, when the mind finally has the space to understand itself. 5. Being alone builds an unshakable relationship with yourself. One of the greatest transformations that happens through solitude is the development of a deep and unshakable relationship with yourself. Many people spend years learning how to interact with others, how to communicate in social situations, and how to adjust their behavior depending on the expectations around them. But very few people ever learn how to truly understand their own inner world. They know how to respond to conversations, responsibilities, and social roles, yet they rarely take the time to explore their own thoughts, emotions, fears, and values. Because of this, their sense of identity often becomes tied to the reactions of others. If people praise them, they feel confident. If people criticize them, they begin doubting themselves. Their self-worth rises and falls depending on how others respond to them. Solitude slowly changes this dynamic. When you spend time alone regularly, you begin forming a connection with yourself that does not depend on the approval of the outside world. In the quiet moments of solitude, you start noticing your own thoughts more clearly. Your emotions become easier to understand, and your inner voice becomes stronger. Instead of constantly adjusting yourself to fit the expectations of others, you begin discovering who you actually are beneath those expectations. At first, spending time alone may feel uncomfortable because the mind has been trained to constantly seek distraction. Many people are so used to external stimulation that silence feels unfamiliar. However, if you remain patient and allow yourself to stay in that quiet space, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind gradually becomes more peaceful. The need for constant noise begins to fade. You start realizing that being alone does not mean being empty or incomplete. Instead, it becomes a moment of genuine connection with your own awareness. During solitude, you begin learning how to listen to yourself. You notice what situations give you energy and what situations quietly drain your peace. You become more aware of your natural strengths, your values, and the things that truly matter to you. This awareness creates a stronger sense of identity because it is no longer built on comparison or social approval. Instead, it grows from a deeper understanding of your own nature. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that true stability comes from within. When a person depends entirely on the outside world for their sense of worth, their peace will always remain fragile because the outside world is constantly changing. People's opinions change, circumstances change, and relationships evolve over time. But when you build a relationship with yourself, your inner stability becomes much stronger. Your confidence is no longer shaken by every criticism or disagreement because your understanding of yourself does not depend on those reactions. Another powerful change that solitude brings is self-trust. When you spend time observing your mind and reflecting on your experiences, you begin trusting your own judgment more. Instead of constantly asking others what you should do or how you should live, you begin listening to your own insight. This does not mean rejecting advice from others, but it means that your decisions come from a place of inner clarity rather than insecurity. Solitude also teaches you how to enjoy your own presence. Many people feel uncomfortable when they are alone because they believe happiness must always come from social interaction. However, when you develop a healthy relationship with yourself, simple moments begin feeling meaningful again. A quiet walk, a moment of reflection, or even sitting peacefully with your own thoughts can bring a sense of calm satisfaction. Instead of needing constant stimulation, the mind learns to appreciate stillness. Over time, this relationship with yourself becomes one of the strongest foundations in your life. When you truly understand yourself, external chaos no longer shakes you as easily. Challenges still appear, difficult situations still arise, but you face them with a stronger inner center. You know how to return to your own awareness, observe your thoughts, and respond with clarity instead of reacting with confusion. In this way, solitude becomes much more than simply being alone. It becomes a space where you build the most important relationship you will ever have, the relationship with your own mind and heart. And once that relationship becomes strong, the rest of your life begins to change as well. 6. Solitude awakens your creativity, your purpose, and your original mind. There is a quiet power hidden inside solitude that most people never fully experience because their lives are constantly filled with noise, movement, and distraction. Every day, the human mind is surrounded by information, conversations, opinions, expectations, notifications, and endless streams of stimulation. While this constant activity may feel normal in modern life, it quietly prevents the mind from accessing one of its most powerful abilities: deep creativity and genuine insight. Buddhist teachings have long understood that the mind reveals its most original ideas not in chaos, but in silence. When a person spends time alone and allows the noise of the world to fade for a while, the mind begins to open in a completely different way. At first, solitude simply feels like quiet. There are fewer conversations, fewer responsibilities pulling at your attention, and fewer distractions competing for space in your thoughts. But if you remain in this silence long enough, something deeper begins happening. The mind gradually slows down. Thoughts that were once rushing past each other begin to settle, and the constant mental tension created by everyday stress starts to soften. In this calmer state, the mind becomes more spacious and flexible. Instead of reacting automatically to everything around it, it begins observing, reflecting, and exploring new ideas. This is where creativity begins to awaken. Many people think creativity belongs only to artists, writers, or inventors, but in reality, creativity is a natural ability that exists in every human mind. Creativity simply means the ability to see things differently, to connect ideas in new ways, and to imagine possibilities that were not obvious before. However, this ability cannot function properly when the mind is constantly overloaded with noise and distraction. When your attention is scattered between endless messages, conversations, and responsibilities, the deeper parts of your thinking never have enough space to operate. Solitude creates that space. When you sit quietly with yourself, the mind begins wandering in a more thoughtful way. Ideas start forming without pressure. You begin noticing connections between things that previously seemed unrelated. A problem that once felt confusing may suddenly appear simple because your mind is now able to look at it from a fresh perspective. Sometimes, insights arrive slowly, like a gradual realization. Other times they appear suddenly, like a moment of clarity that feels almost surprising. Buddhist teachings often describe this experience as returning to the original mind. The original mind is not something mysterious or supernatural. It is simply the natural state of awareness that exists before the mind becomes overwhelmed by fear, pressure, comparison, and endless mental noise. When the mind returns to this original state, it becomes more open, curious, and creative. Instead of repeating the same old patterns of thinking, it begins exploring life with a sense of freshness and possibility. Solitude allows this original mind to reappear. When you are constantly surrounded by other people's expectations and opinions, your thinking slowly begins following the same patterns as everyone around you. You start viewing problems the way others view them. You start chasing the same goals everyone else is chasing. Over time, your imagination becomes limited by the boundaries of social expectations. Without realizing it, your mind becomes trained to think in familiar directions rather than exploring new ones. But when you step away from that environment and spend time alone, those invisible boundaries begin weakening. The mind becomes freer to question assumptions and imagine new paths. You may suddenly realize that the goals you have been chasing do not truly excite you. You may discover new interests that were previously hidden beneath the pressure of daily routines. Sometimes solitude reveals talents or passions that you never noticed before, because your attention was always focused outward instead of inward. This is one of the reasons many spiritual teachers throughout history spent long periods in solitude. They understood that deep understanding and creativity rarely appear in crowded environments. Silence gives the mind the freedom to explore without pressure. Another important transformation that happens in solitude is the discovery of purpose. many people feel uncertain about their direction in life because they are constantly comparing themselves to others. They look at what others are doing and assume they should follow similar paths. However, every person has a unique combination of interests, strengths, and experiences that cannot be discovered through comparison alone. Purpose often reveals itself slowly through reflection. When you spend time alone, you begin noticing patterns in what naturally draws your attention. You begin seeing which activities make you feel alive and which ones leave you feeling drained. These small observations gradually form a clearer picture of what truly matters to you. Instead of chasing goals simply because they appear successful or impressive, you begin moving toward paths that genuinely resonate with your inner nature. Solitude also strengthens your ability to think independently. In a world where people are constantly influenced by social trends and popular opinions, independent thinking becomes extremely valuable. When you regularly spend time observing your own thoughts, you become less dependent on the approval or validation of others. Your ideas begin coming from personal understanding rather than social pressure. This independence allows your creativity to grow even further. You become more willing to explore unusual ideas, to question assumptions, and to experiment with new possibilities. Instead of limiting yourself to what seems safe or familiar, you begin trusting your ability to explore the unknown. Many great innovations in history emerged from individuals who allowed themselves the space to think differently, and solitude was often the environment where those ideas were born. But the awakening of creativity and purpose in solitude is not always dramatic or sudden. Often, it unfolds quietly and gradually. A small idea appears during a moment of reflection. A new perspective forms while observing your thoughts. A realization grows slowly over several days or weeks of quiet thinking. These subtle changes accumulate until eventually your understanding of life becomes clearer and more confident. Solitude teaches you to respect the natural rhythm of insight. In a world that often demands quick answers and immediate results, solitude reminds you that some of the most important discoveries take time to emerge. When the mind is allowed to rest and explore without pressure, it begins revealing ideas that are deeper, more thoughtful, and more aligned with your true nature. Buddhist wisdom emphasizes that the mind is naturally creative and intelligent when it is not clouded by constant distraction. Just as a calm lake reflects the sky clearly when the wind stops disturbing its surface, the human mind reflects insight and creativity when it becomes still. Through solitude, you begin rediscovering this natural clarity. You start realizing that creativity is not something you need to force or chase. It is something that naturally appears when the mind becomes quiet enough to listen. Purpose is not something you must desperately search for in the outside world. It slowly reveals itself when you observe your life honestly and patiently. In this way, solitude becomes much more than simply being alone. It becomes a doorway into the deeper intelligence of your own mind. It awakens creativity, strengthens independent thinking, and gently guides you toward the path that feels most authentic to who you truly are. And when the mind reconnects with this original clarity, life itself begins to feel more meaningful, more intentional, and more alive. 7. The deepest gift of solitude, you discover that you are enough. There is a quiet realization that slowly appears when a person spends enough time in solitude, and this realization has the power to transform the way they see themselves and the world around them. For most of their lives, people are taught to measure their worth through the eyes of others. From a young age, they are praised for achievements, compared with classmates, judged by standards of success, and constantly encouraged to prove themselves. Over time, this creates a deeply rooted belief that value must always come from outside. People begin thinking that they must impress others, gain recognition, or meet certain expectations before they can truly feel worthy. This belief becomes so common that many people never question it. They move through life chasing approval without realizing that the search itself is exhausting them. When someone praises them, they feel uplifted. When someone criticizes them, they feel diminished. Their confidence rises and falls depending on how the world responds to them. Solitude begins to gently challenge this pattern. When you spend time alone, away from constant comparison and outside evaluation, the mind slowly starts noticing something important. The pressure to perform begins fading. The need to prove something to others becomes less intense. In the quiet space of solitude, you are no longer being watched, judged, or evaluated. For a moment, life simply becomes an experience of being rather than performing. At first, this silence may feel unfamiliar. Many people discover that without external interaction, they feel uncertain about themselves. They may wonder who they are when no one else is around to reflect their identity back to them. But if they remain patient and continue spending time in solitude, something profound begins to happen. The mind gradually becomes comfortable with its own presence. Instead of feeling incomplete when alone, a quiet sense of stability begins forming inside. Buddhist teachings often remind us that the deepest nature of a human being is already whole. However, because the mind is constantly chasing validation, it rarely notices this inner completeness. Solitude creates the conditions where this truth can finally be experienced directly rather than simply understood as an idea. As you sit with yourself in silence, you begin observing your thoughts, emotions, and reactions with greater awareness. You start seeing how much energy your mind once spent worrying about how others perceived you. You notice how often you adjusted your behavior to gain approval or avoid rejection. These patterns slowly become visible in the calm space of reflection. But instead of judging yourself for these habits, something else begins appearing: compassion. Through solitude, you begin understanding that these behaviors were simply attempts to feel accepted and safe. The mind was trying to protect itself in the only ways it knew. When this understanding grows, self-criticism begins softening. Instead of constantly trying to fix or improve yourself, you begin allowing yourself to simply exist as you are. This shift is incredibly powerful. For many people, life has always felt like a continuous project of self-improvement. They believe they must always become better, stronger, more successful, or more impressive in order to deserve peace. But solitude slowly reveals that peace does not come from endlessly upgrading yourself. It comes from recognizing the value that already exists within you. When the mind no longer depends entirely on external approval, a new form of confidence begins emerging. This confidence is different from arrogance or pride. It is quiet and steady. It does not need to prove anything. It simply comes from understanding your own nature. In solitude, you begin realizing that your worth is not determined by how productive you are, how popular you are, or how impressive your achievements appear. Your value exists simply because you are a conscious, living being, capable of awareness, understanding, and growth. This realization changes the way you relate to the world. When someone criticizes you, their words no longer shake your sense of identity as strongly as before. When someone praises you, you can appreciate it without becoming dependent on it. Your emotional balance becomes more stable because your sense of self no longer relies entirely on outside reactions. Solitude also helps you recognize how much comparison once influenced your thinking. In everyday life, people constantly compare themselves with others. They compare their success, their appearance, their intelligence, their lifestyle, and even their happiness. This comparison creates a quiet feeling of inadequacy because there will always be someone who seems more successful, more talented, or more admired. But when you step away from constant comparison through solitude, something interesting begins to happen. You start seeing that life is not a competition. Every person is living a completely unique experience, shaped by different circumstances, different abilities, and different journeys. Comparing your path to someone else's path becomes less meaningful once you understand this deeply. Instead of measuring your life against others, you begin focusing on living in a way that feels honest and aligned with your own values. This shift brings a sense of freedom. You no longer feel pressured to constantly chase the same goals as everyone around you. You become more comfortable choosing your own direction even if that direction looks different from the expectations of others. Another beautiful aspect of this realization is the peace it brings to relationships. When a person does not believe they are enough on their own, they often enter relationships hoping that someone else will fill the emptiness they feel inside. They look for validation, reassurance, and emotional security from others. While relationships can certainly bring joy and connection, they cannot permanently fill a sense of inner lack. Solitude reveals this truth gently. When you discover that you are already enough, relationships begin changing in a healthy way. Instead of depending on others to complete you, you begin connecting with them from a place of wholeness. Your relationships become less about seeking approval and more about sharing experiences, understanding, and mutual growth. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove your worth within those relationships. Instead, you bring authenticity and calm presence. Buddhist philosophy often teaches that suffering arises when the mind believes something is missing. We feel that we are not successful enough, not respected enough, not loved enough, or not accomplished enough. These beliefs create a constant sense of striving that keeps the mind restless. Solitude reveals something different. In silence, when the mind is not chasing validation or comparison, you begin experiencing moments where nothing is missing. You are simply sitting, breathing, aware of your existence, and that moment itself feels complete. This realization does not mean you stop growing or pursuing meaningful goals. Instead, it changes the emotional foundation from which those goals are pursued. Instead of chasing success to prove your worth, you pursue growth because it expresses your curiosity and potential. Instead of trying to impress the world, you simply explore life with authenticity. Over time, this understanding creates a deep inner peace. You begin trusting that your life does not need to follow the same timeline or expectations as everyone else's. You allow your journey to unfold naturally, rather than forcing it to match external standards. The deeper you experience solitude, the more this quiet confidence grows. You begin seeing that you are not incomplete, not broken, and not lacking something essential. You are simply a human being, learning, evolving, and experiencing life moment by moment. This is the deepest gift solitude can offer. It removes the illusion that your worth must be earned. It shows you that, beneath the noise of comparison, judgment, and expectation, there has always been a simple truth waiting to be discovered. You are already enough. And once you understand this truth deeply, the way you walk through life begins to change. You move with greater calm, greater authenticity, and greater freedom because you are no longer searching for permission to exist as you are. Solitude does not take you away from the world. Instead, it returns you to the world with a stronger sense of peace and a clearer understanding of yourself. 8. Solitude reveals the freedom of letting go. There comes a point in solitude when the mind begins to see something it could never clearly recognize while surrounded by constant noise and distraction. When life is filled with endless conversations, responsibilities, comparisons, and emotional reactions, the mind rarely pauses long enough to understand the invisible weight it is carrying. People move quickly from one task to another, from one conversation to another, from one emotional reaction to the next, without realizing how many attachments, expectations, and unresolved thoughts are quietly accumulating inside them. But when a person spends enough time in solitude, something important begins to change. The pace of the mind slows down, the emotional turbulence gradually softens, and for the first time, the mind starts noticing the many things it has been holding on to for far too long. At first, these realizations appear subtly. A memory from the past may suddenly arise in the quiet moments of reflection. A situation that once created anger or disappointment may come back into awareness. Old expectations about how life should have unfolded may quietly reappear. In everyday life, these memories often pass through the mind unnoticed because there is always something new demanding attention. But in solitude, they become clearer. the mind begins observing these attachments more honestly. Buddhist teachings often explain that much of human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the way the mind continues clinging to those events long after they have passed. A person may replay an argument from years ago, still feeling anger or regret. Someone else may continue holding on to a dream that never became reality, feeling disappointment each time they remember it. The mind creates stories around these experiences, and over time, those stories become part of how a person understands themselves and their life. Solitude reveals how heavy these stories can become. When the mind sits quietly without distraction, it begins noticing how often it returns to the same memories and expectations. The same thoughts appear again and again, almost like a loop playing in the background of consciousness. At first, this may feel frustrating because the mind realizes how much time it has spent trapped in these patterns. But gradually, something deeper begins to appear: awareness. Awareness changes the relationship between the mind and its attachments. Instead of automatically reacting to every memory or thought, the mind begins observing them from a small distance. A painful memory may arise, but instead of immediately reliving the emotion, the mind simply notices it. A regret from the past may appear, but instead of becoming overwhelmed by it, the mind watches how the feeling moves through awareness and eventually fades. This quiet observation begins creating a new understanding. The mind starts recognizing that many of the things it once believed were permanent emotional wounds are actually temporary experiences that continue only because the mind keeps feeding them attention. When attention relaxes, those emotional patterns slowly lose their strength. This realization is the beginning of letting go. Letting go does not mean forgetting the past or pretending that painful experiences never happened. Instead, it means releasing the emotional grip that those experiences have on the present moment. Through solitude, the mind learns that it is possible to remember something without becoming trapped inside it. A memory can exist without controlling your peace. This understanding creates a deep sense of freedom. Many people spend years trying to change the past in their thoughts. They replay situations, imagining what they could have said differently or how events might have unfolded if circumstances had changed. But the past cannot be rewritten. The only thing that can change is the way the mind relates to it. Solitude teaches the mind to gently loosen its grip. As the mind observes its attachments more clearly, it begins realizing that holding on to them does not actually protect anything. Clinging to anger does not correct the past. Holding on to regret does not create a better outcome. In fact, the more tightly the mind holds on to these experiences, the more suffering it creates for itself. Buddhist philosophy often uses the image of a clenched fist to explain attachment. When the hand is tightly closed, it becomes tense and tired. But when the hand relaxes and opens, the tension disappears immediately. The same principle applies to the mind. When it constantly grasps onto expectations, identities, and emotional stories, it becomes exhausted. But when it relaxes its grip, a natural sense of peace begins returning. Solitude gives the mind the opportunity to practice this relaxation. Without the constant stimulation of everyday life, the mind becomes more aware of when it is clinging to something unnecessarily. You may notice that a thought about the past appears, and instead of following it into a long emotional story, you simply allow it to pass. You may notice a worry about the future arising, but instead of feeding it with fear, you observe it calmly and return to the present moment. With time, this ability becomes stronger. The mind begins spending less energy fighting against reality and more energy simply experiencing life as it unfolds. Instead of constantly wishing things were different, it learns to accept the natural movement of life. This acceptance does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means recognizing that peace comes not from controlling every outcome, but from allowing life to move naturally without unnecessary resistance. Another powerful aspect of letting go in solitude is the release of identities that no longer serve you. Throughout life, people often build identities around their experiences. Someone may think of themselves as the person who was betrayed, the person who failed, or the person who must always prove their worth. These identities can become deeply ingrained because they are repeated in the mind for many years. But when you spend time in solitude, observing your thoughts carefully, you begin noticing that these identities are also stories created by the mind. They are not permanent truths. They are simply interpretations of past experiences that the mind continues repeating. Once you recognize this, those identities begin losing their power. Instead of seeing yourself through the lens of past events, you begin experiencing yourself as something much more fluid and open. You are no longer limited by the stories you once believed defined you. This realization creates a profound sense of lightness. The mind no longer feels burdened by the need to defend or maintain a particular identity. Instead, it becomes free to grow, change, and evolve without being trapped by old narratives. Buddhist wisdom teaches that everything in life is constantly changing. Thoughts change, emotions change, circumstances change, and even our sense of self changes over time. When the mind resists this natural change, suffering appears. But when the mind accepts the impermanent nature of life, it becomes much easier to release attachments that no longer serve us. Solitude is where this understanding becomes clear. In the quiet moments of reflection, the mind sees that life is not meant to be tightly controlled. It is meant to be experienced, learned from, and allowed to move forward naturally. Letting go does not mean losing something valuable. It means freeing yourself from carrying unnecessary weight. And as the mind gradually releases these attachments, something beautiful begins to emerge in their place: space. In that space, there is more calm, more clarity, and more openness to the present moment. Life begins feeling lighter because the mind is no longer burdened by endless emotional baggage from the past or constant fear about the future. This is one of the deepest freedoms solitude can offer. Through quiet reflection and patient awareness, the mind learns that peace does not come from controlling everything in life. Peace comes from understanding when it is time to simply open the hand and let go. And when the mind finally learns this gentle art of release, life begins flowing with a sense of ease that once seemed impossible. Neuf. In solitude, you learn the art of being present. One of the quiet miracles that begins to unfold when a person spends time in solitude is the rediscovery of the present moment. In everyday life, the human mind rarely stays in the present. Instead, it constantly moves between memories of the past and worries about the future. A person may be sitting in a room, yet their mind is replaying something that happened years ago or imagining situations that have not even happened yet. This endless movement of thought pulls the mind away from the reality that is happening right now. Modern life intensifies this problem even further. Every day, people are surrounded by notifications, conversations, responsibilities, news, and constant streams of information that compete for attention. The mind becomes trained to jump rapidly from one thing to another. Even when the body is resting, the mind continues racing through thoughts, plans, fears, and unfinished tasks. Because of this, many people move through life without ever fully experiencing the moment they are living in. Solitude begins to interrupt this pattern. When you step away from constant interaction and spend time alone, the pace of your mental activity begins to slow. There are fewer demands pulling your attention in different directions. The mind no longer needs to react to every conversation or piece of information. At first, this quiet space may feel unusual because the mind has been conditioned to expect constant stimulation. However, if you remain patient and allow yourself to sit in that silence, something subtle begins to happen. The mind gradually starts returning to the present moment. You may begin noticing simple things that normally pass unnoticed. The rhythm of your breathing becomes clearer. The sound of the wind or distant noise becomes more noticeable. The sensation of sitting, walking, or simply existing in a quiet environment becomes more vivid. These small experiences may seem ordinary, yet they carry a depth that many people rarely experience because their attention is always somewhere else. Buddhist teachings emphasize the importance of mindfulness, which means being fully aware of what is happening in the present moment. According to these teachings, much of human suffering arises because the mind constantly escapes the present. When the mind dwells in the past, it often becomes trapped in regret, resentment, or nostalgia. When the mind constantly jumps into the future, it fills itself with worry, fear, and uncertainty. The present moment, however, is where life is actually happening. Solitude provides the conditions where mindfulness can naturally develop. When the mind is not constantly reacting to the outside world, it becomes easier to notice the flow of thoughts and sensations as they arise. You begin observing how thoughts appear and disappear. You notice emotions forming and dissolving. Instead of being lost inside these experiences, you begin watching them with quiet awareness. This shift creates a powerful transformation. Instead of feeling pulled in different directions by your thoughts, you begin experiencing a stable center of awareness. You realize that the present moment is not something small or insignificant. It is the only place where your life is truly unfolding. At first, this awareness may appear only for short periods. You may notice your breathing for a few seconds before the mind drifts into thinking again. But over time, as solitude becomes a regular practice, the ability to remain present begins growing stronger. The mind learns how to rest in awareness rather than constantly chasing thoughts. This change affects every part of life. When you become more present, ordinary experiences begin feeling richer and more meaningful. A simple walk outside becomes an opportunity to notice the movement of the body and the details of the environment. A quiet moment of rest becomes an experience of genuine peace rather than boredom. Even everyday activities such as eating, listening, or observing nature begin carrying a deeper sense of calm awareness. Solitude also reveals how much of life was previously spent in distraction. Many people discover that their minds were rarely at rest. Even during moments that were meant to be relaxing, the mind was still worrying about the future or replaying the past. Through solitude, this habit becomes visible, and once it is seen clearly, it becomes easier to gently let it go. Another powerful effect of presence is the reduction of anxiety. When the mind constantly imagines future problems, it creates tension that does not actually exist in the present moment. The body reacts to imagined dangers as if they were real. This is why people often feel stressed even when nothing threatening is happening around them. By learning to stay present, the mind gradually stops feeding these imagined fears. Instead of worrying about everything that might go wrong tomorrow, you begin focusing on what is happening right now, in the present moment. Many of the problems the mind was worrying about simply do not exist. There is only breathing, awareness, and the immediate experience of being alive. Buddhist philosophy teaches that peace is always available in the present moment, but the mind often misses it because it is searching somewhere else. Solitude helps reveal this truth in a very direct way. When you sit quietly without distraction, you may suddenly notice that nothing is actually missing from this moment. You are breathing, you are aware, and life is unfolding naturally. For a brief moment, the mind stops searching for something else and simply rests in the experience of being. These moments of presence can feel surprisingly peaceful. They show that happiness does not always come from achieving something new or solving every problem. Sometimes it appears simply by allowing yourself to fully experience the moment that is already here. Solitude also deepens your understanding of time. In everyday life, people often feel that time is rushing past them. Days feel busy, weeks feel crowded with responsibilities, and months seem to disappear quickly. This feeling happens because the mind is rarely paying attention to the present moment. When attention is scattered across past memories and future plans, the experience of time becomes blurred. But when you are present, time begins to feel different. Moments become clearer and more vivid. A few minutes of quiet awareness can feel deeply fulfilling, because you are actually experiencing those minutes instead of mentally escaping them. Life begins feeling less rushed because you are no longer mentally running ahead of yourself. Through solitude, the mind slowly learns to appreciate the simplicity of being present. You begin realizing that many of the things you once believed were necessary for happiness were actually distractions from the peace that was already available. The present moment does not require perfect circumstances to exist. It simply asks for awareness. Over time, this awareness becomes a quiet foundation beneath everything you do. Whether you are working, resting, walking, or interacting with others, a part of your attention remains connected to the present moment. This connection creates a deeper sense of calm. You are no longer constantly chasing the future or fighting the past. Instead, you begin moving through life with a steady awareness of what is happening right now. This is one of the most valuable gifts solitude can offer. It teaches the mind how to return home to the present moment. And once you rediscover the ability to be fully present, life begins to feel more vivid, more peaceful, and more meaningful than it ever did when your mind was lost in endless distraction. 10. Solitude shows you that your inner peace does not depend on the world. One of the most powerful realizations that slowly unfolds through solitude is the discovery that your inner peace does not actually depend on the outside world as much as you once believed. Most people grow up thinking that peace will come once certain conditions are finally satisfied. They believe they will feel calm when their problems disappear, when other people treat them perfectly, when their future becomes secure, or when life unfolds exactly the way they planned. Because of this belief, the mind spends years chasing a peaceful life that always seems to remain just slightly out of reach. The difficulty with this approach is that the outside world is constantly changing. Circumstances shift, people behave in unexpected ways, plans evolve, and life rarely follows a perfectly predictable path. When peace depends entirely on external conditions, the mind becomes fragile because every unexpected event has the power to disturb it. One difficult conversation, one unexpected setback, or one moment of criticism can suddenly disrupt the sense of stability a person thought they had achieved. Solitude slowly begins revealing a different possibility. When you spend time alone and allow the noise of everyday life to fade, the mind starts observing its own reactions more clearly. You begin noticing how often your emotional state changes in response to events outside your control. A positive message from someone can lift your mood, while a negative comment can immediately create tension. A successful moment can make you feel confident, while a small failure can make you question yourself. These shifts happen so quickly that many people rarely pause to notice them. In solitude, however, this pattern becomes visible. Without the constant distractions of everyday interaction, the mind becomes quiet enough to observe how it reacts to its own thoughts and expectations. You begin realizing that many of the disturbances you experience are not actually caused by the events themselves, but by the way the mind interprets those events. Two people can experience the same situation, yet respond in completely different ways because their minds are relating to the experience differently. Buddhist teachings often emphasize this understanding. According to Buddhist wisdom, peace is not something that must be created by controlling the world around you. Instead, peace emerges when the mind learns how to observe its reactions without becoming trapped inside them. This shift may sound subtle, but its impact on life can be profound. Solitude provides the environment where this realization becomes clearer. When you sit quietly with your thoughts, you begin observing how the mind constantly creates stories about everything it experiences. A small inconvenience becomes a large problem in the mind's narrative. A minor misunderstanding becomes a personal insult. The mind builds emotional reactions based on interpretations that may not even be accurate. As you observe these patterns in solitude, a new form of awareness begins appearing. Instead of immediately believing every interpretation the mind creates, you start noticing that these thoughts are simply mental constructions. They are not permanent truths. They are temporary perspectives that can change. This understanding weakens the automatic power those thoughts once had over your emotional state. For example, a thought about a past mistake may arise during solitude. In the past, such a thought might have triggered strong regret or self-criticism. But now, as you observe the thought calmly, you begin noticing that it is simply a memory passing through awareness. It does not have to define who you are or control how you feel in the present moment. The same shift begins happening with worries about the future. When the mind imagines uncertain outcomes, it often reacts with anxiety. However, through solitude, you begin recognizing that these imagined scenarios are simply thoughts about possibilities, not realities that are actually happening right now. As the mind learns to observe these thoughts without immediately reacting, the emotional tension surrounding them begins fading. This process gradually reveals an important truth. Inner peace does not require a perfect life. It requires a mind that understands how to observe experience without becoming overwhelmed by it. Solitude strengthens this ability because it gives the mind the quiet space needed to practice awareness. Without constant stimulation, you begin noticing the difference between what is actually happening and the stories the mind creates about what is happening. As this awareness deepens, your emotional stability begins growing stronger. Situations that once disturbed your peace may still occur, but your reaction to them becomes calmer and more balanced. Instead of immediately resisting or fighting every unpleasant experience, you begin allowing events to unfold while maintaining a sense of inner steadiness. Buddhist philosophy often compares the peaceful mind to a deep lake. When the surface of the lake is disturbed by strong winds, the water becomes turbulent and unclear. But deep beneath the surface, the water remains calm and still. In the same way, external events may continue happening in life, but through awareness developed in solitude, the deeper level of your mind can remain stable even when the surface experiences movement. This stability does not mean becoming indifferent to life. It means understanding that your peace does not need to be controlled by every external event. Another important transformation that occurs through solitude is the reduction of emotional dependency. Many people unknowingly depend on others to regulate their emotional state. They seek reassurance, validation, or approval to feel secure. When those responses are not received, they feel unsettled or uncertain. Solitude gently reduces this dependency. As you spend time alone and observe your mind more carefully, you begin discovering that calmness can arise from within rather than from the reactions of others. The mind becomes more familiar with its own rhythms and begins trusting its ability to regain balance even when situations are challenging. This self-reliance creates a deeper form of peace. Instead of constantly searching for external conditions that guarantee happiness, you begin carrying a sense of stability within yourself. You recognize that while you cannot control everything happening around you, you can develop a relationship with your own mind that remains steady in the midst of change. Over time, this realization transforms the way you approach life. You stop expecting the world to behave perfectly before you allow yourself to feel calm. Instead, you learn how to maintain awareness and balance even when circumstances are unpredictable. This does not remove challenges from life. Difficult moments still occur, unexpected events still arise, and relationships still involve complexity. But the difference is that your sense of peace is no longer completely dependent on those external factors. It comes from understanding your own mind. Solitude becomes the teacher that reveals this understanding. In the quiet moments of reflection, you discover that peace is not hidden somewhere in the future, waiting for life to become perfect. It is something that can exist right now, even in the middle of uncertainty. Once this realization becomes part of your experience, life begins to feel less overwhelming. You move through challenges with greater patience, interact with others with more understanding, and face uncertainty with a calmer perspective. Solitude does not remove you from the world. Instead, it returns you to the world with a deeper sense of inner stability. And when the mind learns that peace can exist independently of external circumstances, something extraordinary begins to happen. Life becomes less about constantly controlling events and more about experiencing each moment with awareness, clarity, and quiet strength. 11. Solitude teaches you how to live without losing yourself. One of the most important lessons solitude offers is the ability to live in the world without losing your sense of self. Many people move through life, slowly becoming shaped by the expectations, opinions, and pressures around them. At first, this happens quietly and almost invisibly. A person begins adjusting their behavior to fit social expectations. They change the way they speak, the way they think, and sometimes even the way they see themselves, just to feel accepted by the people around them. Over time, this constant adjustment can slowly blur the line between who they truly are and who they believe they must become in order to belong. This process happens so gradually that most people do not even notice it happening. They believe they are simply adapting to life. But deep inside, there is often a quiet feeling that something is missing. They may feel exhausted from constantly trying to maintain an image. They may feel uncertain about what they truly want, because so many of their choices were shaped by outside influence. In some cases, they may even feel disconnected from their own values, as if they are living a version of life that does not fully belong to them. Solitude begins to reveal this pattern. When you step away from constant interaction and spend time alone, the influence of the outside world becomes quieter. Without the pressure to respond to others or maintain a certain image, the mind finally has the space to observe itself more honestly. In that silence, you may begin noticing how often your thoughts were shaped by other people's expectations. You may recognize decisions you made primarily to gain approval rather than because they truly aligned with your inner values. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first. Many people discover that they spent years trying to satisfy expectations that were never truly their own. They may see how comparison influenced their goals or how fear of rejection shaped their behavior. But this awareness is not meant to create regret. Instead, it becomes the starting point for rediscovering your authentic self. Buddhist teachings often emphasize the importance of awareness in understanding the mind. According to these teachings, people often become trapped in patterns of behavior simply because they never pause long enough to observe them clearly. Solitude creates that pause. In the quiet space of reflection, the mind begins seeing its habits, fears, and motivations with greater clarity. As this awareness grows, you begin asking deeper questions about your life. You may start wondering which beliefs truly belong to you and which ones were inherited from your environment. You may begin questioning goals that once seemed unquestionable. You may even realize that certain paths you were pursuing were driven more by social pressure than by genuine curiosity or passion. This process is not about rejecting the world. It is about reconnecting with your inner direction so that your choices come from understanding rather than from unconscious influence. Solitude helps you rediscover your inner compass. When the mind becomes quiet, your natural sense of direction begins to appear more clearly. You start noticing what genuinely resonates with you and what feels forced. You begin recognizing which activities bring a sense of meaningful engagement and which ones quietly drain your energy. These insights may seem small at first, but they gradually reshape the way you move through life. Instead of constantly adjusting yourself to match every expectation around you, you begin making choices that align with your deeper values. You become more comfortable saying yes to what truly matters and no to what does not. This shift creates a powerful sense of inner stability. When you know who you are and what you value, the opinions of others lose some of their power over your emotional state. Criticism may still appear, but it no longer shakes your sense of identity as easily. Praise may still feel pleasant, but it no longer becomes the foundation of your self-worth. You begin standing more firmly in your own understanding. Solitude also teaches you that being true to yourself does not mean isolating yourself from others. In fact, when you reconnect with your authentic nature, your relationships often become healthier and more meaningful. Instead of constantly trying to fit into every expectation, you interact with others more honestly. This honesty creates stronger connections. When people relate to each other without masks or constant performance, communication becomes clearer and more genuine. Instead of seeking approval, you begin sharing your thoughts and experiences with openness and respect. Buddhist wisdom often reminds us that suffering increases when we try to be something we are not. When a person constantly fights against their own nature in order to satisfy external expectations, the mind becomes restless and conflicted. But when you allow yourself to live according to your authentic values, a quiet sense of harmony begins to emerge. Solitude helps cultivate this harmony. In the silence of reflection, the mind learns how to recognize its true motivations. You begin seeing the difference between desires that come from genuine curiosity and desires that arise from comparison or fear. Over time, this awareness transforms your relationship with the world. You stop feeling like you must constantly prove yourself or compete with others to justify your existence. Instead, you begin approaching life with a quieter confidence that comes from understanding who you are. This confidence does not need to announce itself loudly. It appears as a calm steadiness in the way you think, speak, and act. You become less reactive to pressure and more guided by your own clarity. Another important aspect of this transformation is the ability to remain yourself even when circumstances change. Life is constantly evolving. New environments appear, new relationships form, and unexpected challenges arise. When a person lacks a strong connection with themselves, these changes can easily pull them away from their values. But solitude strengthens your inner foundation. By regularly spending time observing your thoughts and reconnecting with your deeper understanding, you build a stable center that remains present even when life becomes unpredictable. From this center, you can adapt to changing circumstances without losing your identity. You remain open to growth and learning while still honoring the principles that matter most to you. This balance is one of the greatest gifts solitude can offer. It teaches you how to live fully in the world without becoming controlled by it. You can participate in relationships, pursue meaningful goals, and engage with society while still maintaining a deep awareness of who you are. Instead of drifting through life guided only by external influence, you move forward with intention and clarity. Solitude becomes the place where you regularly return to reconnect with this clarity. Each time you step away from the noise of the world and sit quietly with your thoughts, you strengthen your relationship with your authentic self. Over time, this practice becomes a quiet source of strength that supports every aspect of your life. You no longer feel lost in the expectations of others. You no longer feel pressured to become someone else in order to feel accepted. Instead, you begin living with a sense of integrity that comes from knowing your own mind and honoring your own path. This is the lesson solitude quietly teaches. It shows you that the most meaningful life is not built by constantly adjusting yourself to fit the world's expectations. It is built by understanding who you truly are and learning how to live in the world without losing that understanding. 12. Solitude leads you back to the deepest understanding of life. There comes a moment in the journey of solitude when a person begins realizing that being alone is not simply about escaping noise or taking a break from people. At a deeper level, solitude becomes a doorway into understanding life itself. Most people move through life quickly, reacting to situations, chasing goals, solving problems, and constantly trying to manage responsibilities. While this constant movement keeps life progressing, it also prevents the mind from pausing long enough to ask the deeper questions that shape true understanding. Questions about meaning, purpose, suffering, and the nature of happiness often remain hidden beneath the surface of everyday activity. Solitude creates the conditions where these deeper questions can finally appear. When the noise of daily life fades and the mind is no longer constantly responding to external demands, something interesting begins to happen. The mind naturally turns inward. Without distraction, thoughts begin exploring areas that were previously ignored. A person may begin reflecting on the direction of their life, the choices they have made, and the values that guide their decisions. These reflections are not rushed or forced. They emerge slowly and naturally as the mind settles into quiet awareness. Buddhist teachings have long emphasized the importance of this kind of reflection. According to Buddhist philosophy, many people live in a state of unconscious habit. They follow routines, react emotionally to situations, and chase desires without ever deeply examining why they do what they do. This does not mean their lives are meaningless, but it does mean they are often guided more by habit than by understanding. Solitude interrupts this pattern. When a person spends time alone and allows the mind to observe itself carefully, the automatic habits of thinking and reacting begin to slow down. In this slower mental environment, awareness becomes sharper. You begin noticing the motivations behind your actions. You start seeing how certain fears influence your decisions and how certain desires shape your goals. This awareness gradually creates a deeper understanding of life. For example, through solitude, you may begin noticing how often the mind searches for happiness in external achievements. You may realize that many of your goals were connected to the belief that success, recognition, or approval would eventually create lasting peace. Yet as you observe your own experiences more honestly, you may notice that each achievement brings only temporary satisfaction before the mind begins searching for the next goal. This observation does not mean achievements are meaningless. Instead, it reveals something important about the nature of desire. Buddhist wisdom explains that the mind often believes happiness exists somewhere in the future. It imagines that once certain conditions are fulfilled, peace will finally arrive. But through quiet reflection and solitude, you may begin recognizing that this future-oriented search often prevents the mind from appreciating the present moment. Solitude gently reveals this pattern. As you sit with yourself and observe your thoughts, you begin seeing how the mind continuously moves from one expectation to another. It thinks about what could have been different in the past, and it imagines what must happen in the future for life to feel complete. But in the stillness of solitude, something unexpected begins to appear. You may notice that when the mind stops chasing past regrets and future expectations, a quiet sense of peace begins appearing naturally. In those moments, nothing extraordinary has happened. You are simply sitting, breathing, and observing the present moment. Yet the mind feels calmer than it did while chasing endless goals. This realization becomes one of the deepest insights solitude can offer. It reveals that peace is not necessarily found by constantly changing the world around you. Instead, peace often appears when the mind learns how to rest in awareness rather than constantly chasing something else. Solitude also deepens your understanding of suffering. Every human life contains moments of difficulty. Loss, disappointment, uncertainty, and emotional pain are unavoidable parts of existence. Many people spend their lives trying to escape these experiences or pretending they should not exist. However, Buddhist philosophy teaches that suffering becomes more manageable when it is understood rather than resisted. In solitude, the mind gains the space to observe suffering more carefully. Instead of immediately reacting with fear or frustration when difficult emotions arise, you begin noticing how these emotions move through the mind. You may observe sadness appearing like a wave and gradually fading. You may notice anger arising when expectations are not met, and then slowly dissolving when attention shifts. Through this observation, the mind begins understanding that emotions are temporary experiences rather than permanent identities. This realization changes the relationship you have with difficult emotions. Instead of fighting against them or feeling overwhelmed by them, you begin observing them with curiosity and patience. Over time, this approach reduces the intensity of emotional suffering because the mind no longer treats every unpleasant feeling as a permanent crisis. Solitude also reveals the impermanent nature of life. As you observe your thoughts, emotions, and experiences more closely, you begin noticing how constantly everything changes. Thoughts appear and disappear. Emotions rise and fall. Situations evolve, and even your understanding of yourself continues transforming. This constant movement of change is one of the central teachings in Buddhism. Understanding impermanence can initially feel unsettling because it shows that nothing in life remains exactly the same forever. But solitude also reveals the peaceful side of this truth. If everything changes, then even difficult experiences are temporary. Painful emotions eventually fade. Hard situations eventually transform. Moments of confusion eventually lead to clarity. Solitude allows the mind to witness this natural rhythm of change directly. Through observation, you begin trusting that life moves in cycles, rather than remaining permanently stuck in any single state. Another important insight that emerges through solitude is the recognition of interconnection. When the mind becomes quieter, you begin seeing how deeply connected your experiences are with the world around you. Your thoughts are influenced by the environment you live in. Your emotions respond to the people around you. Even your sense of identity has been shaped by countless interactions and experiences. This realization does not reduce individuality. Instead, it expands awareness by showing that life is part of a much larger flow of causes and conditions. Understanding this interconnection often creates a sense of humility and compassion. You begin recognizing that everyone you encounter is also navigating their own experiences, their own struggles, and their own attempts to find meaning in life. This understanding softens judgment and strengthens empathy. Instead of seeing life as a competition where everyone must prove their worth, you begin seeing it as a shared journey where every person is learning and evolving in their own way. Solitude also encourages simplicity. When the mind is no longer constantly stimulated by endless desires and distractions, it begins appreciating simple experiences more deeply. A quiet moment of reflection, a walk in nature, or the feeling of calm breathing can suddenly feel meaningful. This shift in perspective reduces the need for constant stimulation. Life becomes less about chasing excitement and more about experiencing awareness. Buddhist teachings often describe enlightenment not as a dramatic transformation, but as a clear understanding of life as it truly is. Solitude does not necessarily lead to enlightenment, but it certainly creates the environment where deeper understanding can grow. When the mind regularly spends time in reflection, its awareness becomes sharper and more compassionate. You begin noticing the patterns that once controlled your reactions. You see how attachment creates suffering and how acceptance creates peace. These insights gradually reshape the way you live. Instead of moving through life blindly following habits and expectations, you begin approaching each moment with awareness. Your actions become more intentional. Your responses become calmer. Your understanding becomes deeper. Solitude does not separate you from life. Instead, it reconnects you with life at a deeper level. Through quiet reflection, the mind learns how to see clearly, how to accept change, and how to find peace in the present moment. And as this understanding grows, you begin realizing that the purpose of solitude was never simply to be alone. It was to discover the deeper truth that had always been waiting beneath the noise of everyday life. 13. Solitude teaches you the courage to walk your own path. One of the deepest transformations that begins to unfold through solitude is the quiet development of courage. Not the loud and dramatic kind of courage that is often celebrated in stories, but a quieter and more powerful form that grows slowly inside the mind. This courage is the ability to walk through life guided by your own understanding, rather than constantly following the direction of the crowd. Most people spend a large part of their lives influenced by the expectations and opinions of others. From the moment they are young, they are told what success should look like, what goals they should pursue, and what kind of life they should try to build. These ideas are repeated so often that they begin to feel like unquestionable truths. At first, following these expectations may seem natural because humans are social beings who naturally seek belonging and acceptance. Being part of a group provides security and comfort. It reassures the mind that it is moving in the right direction. However, over time, this desire for acceptance can slowly pull a person away from their authentic path. They may begin choosing careers, lifestyles, or goals not because they deeply resonate with them, but because they appear socially approved or admired by others. This is where solitude begins to play a powerful role. When you step away from the constant influence of other people's opinions and spend time alone, the mind gradually becomes quieter. In that quiet space, you begin hearing thoughts that were previously drowned out by the noise of social expectations. Questions may arise that you never allowed yourself to ask before. You may begin wondering whether the path you are following truly reflects your inner values. You may notice certain goals feel empty, even though they appear impressive on the outside. Solitude does not force you to reject society or abandon your responsibilities. Instead, it gives you the clarity needed to understand the difference between living according to your own truth and living according to external pressure. Buddhist philosophy often teaches that much of human suffering arises from attachment to approval and fear of rejection. When a person constantly seeks validation from others, their happiness becomes dependent on how they are perceived. They may hesitate to express their true opinions, avoid pursuing meaningful dreams, or suppress parts of their personality simply to maintain acceptance. In solitude, this pattern becomes visible. Without the constant feedback of social interaction, the mind begins observing how much influence external approval once had over its decisions. You may remember moments when you stayed silent, even though you had something meaningful to say. You may recognize times when you avoided pursuing something you loved because you feared judgment or misunderstanding. At first, these realizations can feel uncomfortable, but awareness is the first step toward freedom. When the mind clearly sees the ways it once limited itself, it begins developing the courage to act differently in the future. This courage grows slowly through reflection and understanding. Solitude strengthens this courage because it reconnects you with your inner compass. Your inner compass is the quiet sense of direction that emerges when the mind is no longer overwhelmed by outside influence. It is the understanding of what truly matters to you, what kind of person you want to become, and what path feels meaningful for your life. In everyday life, this inner compass is often overshadowed by the louder voices of society. People may offer advice, criticism, or expectations that push your thinking in many different directions. While some of these perspectives can be helpful, they can also create confusion when they are constantly competing with your own intuition. Solitude gives your inner compass the space to become clearer. As you spend time reflecting on your experiences, values, and motivations, you begin understanding yourself more deeply. You start recognizing the difference between decisions made from fear and decisions made from authenticity. This understanding gradually builds confidence. Not the kind of confidence that needs constant praise, but a quieter confidence that comes from knowing yourself. When you understand your values clearly, you become less afraid of disagreement or misunderstanding. You realize that walking your own path does not require universal approval. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that every person must walk their own journey. No one else can fully experience your life or understand every detail of your inner world. Advice from others may offer guidance, but ultimately, your path must be discovered through your own awareness. Solitude becomes the environment where this discovery happens. In the silence of reflection, you begin seeing your life more clearly. You notice patterns that once influenced your behavior. You recognize dreams that were quietly waiting beneath layers of expectation. These insights gradually reshape the way you approach your future. Instead of constantly asking, "What do others expect from me?" you begin asking a different question. What feels true to who I am? This shift may seem small, but it changes everything. When decisions come from authenticity rather than fear, your actions become more aligned with your deeper values. Even when challenges appear, you face them with greater determination because the path you are walking belongs to you. Another powerful aspect of solitude is that it teaches patience. Many people feel pressured to achieve success quickly because they compare their progress with others. Social media, cultural expectations, and competitive environments often create the impression that life must move at a certain speed. But solitude reveals that every journey unfolds at its own pace. When you are not constantly comparing yourself with others, you begin appreciating the unique rhythm of your own growth. Some lessons require time, some insights appear gradually. Solitude reminds you that meaningful development cannot always be rushed. This patience strengthens the courage to continue walking your own path, even when progress feels slow. You begin trusting that growth is happening beneath the surface, even if it is not immediately visible. Solitude also teaches resilience. When you rely entirely on social approval for motivation, setbacks can feel devastating. A single failure or criticism may cause you to question your entire direction. But when your path is guided by deeper understanding, temporary setbacks lose some of their power. You learn to view obstacles as opportunities for learning rather than as signs that you should abandon your journey. Buddhist philosophy often describes life as a path of continuous learning. Every experience contains lessons that help refine understanding. Solitude provides the quiet space needed to reflect on those lessons. Through reflection, you begin recognizing how challenges have shaped your growth. Difficult moments that once felt overwhelming may later reveal themselves as important turning points. This realization strengthens your courage even further. You begin trusting that uncertainty and difficulty are natural parts of life rather than signs that something is wrong. Another beautiful transformation that solitude encourages is the ability to respect the uniqueness of others while still honoring your own path. When you develop confidence in your own direction, you no longer feel threatened by the choices of others. Instead of comparing your life with theirs, you begin appreciating the diversity of human journeys. Each person is exploring life in their own way. Some may follow traditional paths, while others pursue unconventional ones. Solitude helps you see that neither path is inherently superior. What matters is whether a person is living with awareness and authenticity. This understanding reduces unnecessary conflict and judgment. You become more open to learning from others while still maintaining your own perspective. In this way, solitude does not isolate you from society. Instead, it prepares you to engage with the world more consciously. When you return from periods of reflection, you carry with you a clearer sense of who you are. Your interactions become more genuine because they are not driven by the need to impress or conform. You contribute to the world from a place of authenticity rather than obligation. Over time, this authenticity becomes one of your greatest strengths. People often recognize sincerity when they encounter it. A person who is comfortable with their own path carries a calm presence that does not require constant explanation. Solitude nurtures this presence. Each moment of reflection strengthens your connection with your inner compass. Each insight deepens your understanding of what truly matters. And gradually, without dramatic effort, you begin living with a quiet courage that allows you to walk your own path with clarity, patience, and confidence. This is one of the most meaningful gifts solitude can offer. It teaches you that life is not about perfectly following the expectations of the world. It is about discovering the path that resonates with your deepest understanding and having the courage to walk it. 14. Solitude awakens the deep intelligence of your mind. One of the quiet transformations that unfolds through solitude is the awakening of a deeper form of intelligence that already exists within the human mind. In everyday life, people often rely heavily on quick thinking, reactions, and external information. They read, watch, listen, and respond constantly. While this constant activity can make life productive and fast-moving, it also fills the mind with so much noise that deeper understanding rarely has the chance to appear. The human mind is incredibly capable of insight, creativity, and wisdom. But these qualities usually emerge only when the mind is calm enough to observe rather than constantly react. Solitude creates the conditions where this deeper intelligence begins to awaken. When a person spends time alone, away from endless conversations and distractions, the mind slowly shifts into a different mode of thinking. Instead of reacting immediately to everything around it, the mind begins reflecting. It becomes more patient, more curious, and more capable of seeing patterns that were previously hidden by constant stimulation. Thoughts no longer rush past each other with urgency. Instead, they move more slowly, allowing the mind to explore ideas more deeply. Buddhist teachings often describe this state as the beginning of true awareness. Awareness is not simply thinking more. It is the ability to observe thoughts, emotions, and experiences with clarity. When awareness grows stronger, the mind becomes capable of understanding situations from a deeper perspective. Solitude strengthens this awareness. In the quiet space of reflection, the mind begins noticing things it previously overlooked. You may start seeing how certain reactions are connected to old habits. You may recognize patterns in your decisions that you never questioned before. Situations that once felt confusing may suddenly make sense, because your mind now has the calm attention needed to examine them properly. This deeper intelligence is different from the type of knowledge most people chase in everyday life. Knowledge often comes from external sources, such as books, conversations, or education. While knowledge is valuable, it does not always lead to understanding. A person may know many facts, yet still struggle to understand themselves or the deeper patterns shaping their life. Solitude bridges this gap. When you spend time observing your own thoughts and experiences, knowledge gradually transforms into understanding. Instead of merely collecting information, you begin connecting ideas with personal insight. You see how certain principles apply directly to your life. For example, you may have heard many times that attachment creates suffering. It is a common teaching in Buddhist philosophy. But through solitude, you begin seeing how this principle appears in your own experiences. You may notice how clinging to expectations about the future creates anxiety. You may observe how holding on to past disappointments continues to create emotional tension. When you see these patterns directly in your own mind, the teaching becomes real rather than theoretical. This is the deeper intelligence that solitude awakens. It allows you to understand life through observation and experience, rather than through abstract ideas alone. Another important aspect of this awakening is the ability to think independently. In a busy social environment, people are constantly influenced by the thoughts and opinions of others. Conversations, media, and cultural expectations shape the way individuals interpret events. Over time, it becomes easy to adopt beliefs simply because they are widely accepted. Solitude creates distance from these influences. When the mind is no longer surrounded by constant opinions, it begins forming its own perspective. This does not mean rejecting the wisdom of others, but it means examining ideas more carefully rather than accepting them automatically. Through reflection, you begin asking deeper questions. Why do I believe this idea? Does it truly align with my experience? What evidence supports this assumption? These questions strengthen your ability to think clearly and independently. Buddhist teachings encourage this kind of inquiry. The Buddha himself advised his followers not to accept teachings blindly, but to examine them carefully through personal understanding. Solitude supports this examination. Without distraction, the mind becomes capable of deeper inquiry. Instead of rushing toward quick conclusions, it learns to sit with questions patiently. Over time, this patience reveals insights that might have been missed in a more hurried environment. Solitude also sharpens your ability to observe subtle details. In a noisy environment, attention is constantly divided. The mind jumps from one stimulus to another without fully noticing what is happening. But in solitude, attention becomes more focused. You begin noticing small shifts in your thoughts and emotions. For example, you may observe how a single negative thought can gradually grow into a larger emotional reaction if it is not recognized early. You may notice how certain environments influence your mental state, or how specific habits affect your energy and focus. This level of observation strengthens self-understanding. Instead of feeling confused by your reactions, you begin seeing the chain of events that leads to them. You recognize the triggers that create stress or distraction. Once these patterns become visible, it becomes easier to change them. Another powerful benefit of solitude is the awakening of intuition. Intuition is often described as the quiet inner guidance that helps a person sense what feels right or wrong in a particular situation. In a world filled with constant noise, this inner guidance is often difficult to hear. The mind becomes overwhelmed by external opinions and competing advice. Solitude clears this noise. When the mind becomes calm and attentive, intuitive understanding begins appearing naturally. You may notice subtle feelings guiding your decisions. Certain choices may feel aligned with your deeper values, while others may create a sense of discomfort even if they appear logical on the surface. This intuitive awareness complements rational thinking. It helps you evaluate situations from both intellectual and emotional perspectives. Over time, the balance between logic and intuition creates a more complete form of intelligence. Solitude also encourages humility in the face of complexity. When the mind becomes more reflective, it begins recognizing how much there is still to learn about life. Questions about purpose, consciousness, and the nature of reality become more interesting than simple answers. This humility does not weaken the mind. It strengthens curiosity and openness. Instead of believing you already understand everything, you remain willing to explore new ideas and perspectives. This openness allows your intelligence to continue evolving. Buddhist philosophy often describes wisdom as a lifelong process rather than a final achievement. Each insight reveals new layers of understanding. Solitude supports this continuous learning by providing regular opportunities for reflection. Another remarkable aspect of solitude is its ability to deepen concentration. In modern life, many people struggle with fragmented attention. Notifications, multitasking, and constant stimulation train the mind to shift focus rapidly. As a result, it becomes difficult to maintain deep concentration for extended periods. Solitude reverses this pattern. Without constant interruptions, the mind gradually regains its ability to focus deeply on a single idea or observation. This concentration allows you to explore topics more thoroughly and develop more thoughtful insights. Over time, the combination of awareness, reflection, intuition, and concentration creates a powerful form of intelligence. It is not limited to solving technical problems or memorizing information. Instead, it helps you navigate life with greater clarity and understanding. You become more capable of recognizing the causes behind events. You become more aware of the emotions influencing your decisions. You begin seeing connections between experiences that once seemed unrelated. This clarity transforms the way you approach challenges. Instead of reacting impulsively, you pause and observe. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by confusion, you explore the situation with curiosity. Solitude does not remove challenges from life, but it equips your mind with the awareness needed to respond to those challenges wisely. Over time, this deeper intelligence becomes a quiet guide that supports every part of your life. Your decisions become more thoughtful. Your reactions become calmer. Your understanding of yourself and others becomes more compassionate. And gradually, you begin realizing that the purpose of solitude was never simply to escape the noise of the world. It was to rediscover the powerful intelligence that was always present within your own mind, waiting for the quiet space needed to awaken. 2:15. Solitude teaches you the sacred art of returning to yourself. There is a subtle truth about human life that many people discover only after years of chasing goals, responsibilities, and expectations. The truth is that in the process of trying to build a life, people often slowly move away from themselves. They become so focused on what must be achieved, what must be fixed, and what must be proven that they forget to pause and ask a simple but profound question. Who am I beneath all of this activity? Solitude becomes the place where this question finally receives the attention it deserves. In the fast rhythm of everyday life, the mind rarely has time to return to itself. People wake up with responsibilities already waiting for them. They move through conversations, obligations, and endless streams of information that demand attention. Even moments that are meant for rest often become filled with distraction. Phones glow with notifications, entertainment fills silence, and the mind remains constantly occupied. While this constant engagement may appear productive, it also creates distance between a person and their inner awareness. Over time, many people begin living almost entirely outwardly. Their attention is directed toward tasks, expectations, and interactions with others. But very little attention is given to the quiet inner space where understanding grows. Solitude gently reverses this pattern. When you step away from constant activity and spend time alone, the mind begins slowing down. At first, this slowdown may feel uncomfortable because the mind is accustomed to constant stimulation. Thoughts may appear rapidly, jumping from one idea to another, as if trying to fill the silence. But if you remain patient and allow the mind to settle naturally, something deeper begins happening. The mind begins returning to itself. This return is not dramatic or sudden. It happens quietly, through awareness. You begin noticing your breathing more clearly. You become aware of the subtle movements of thought. Emotions that were once hidden beneath busyness begin appearing gently in your awareness. Buddhist teachings often describe this process as coming home to the mind. The mind, like a traveler who has wandered far from its starting point, slowly finds its way back to its natural center. This center is not something mysterious or distant. It is simply the state of awareness that exists when the mind is not constantly chasing something outside itself. Through solitude, you begin rediscovering this center. At first, this experience may appear as simple moments of calm. You may notice a sense of quiet clarity while sitting alone. The mind may feel less rushed, less pressured, and more open to observing what is happening inside. Over time, these moments of calm deepen into something more meaningful. You begin recognizing that returning to yourself is not merely about relaxation. It is about reconnecting with the deeper layers of your mind that were often ignored while life was moving quickly. These deeper layers hold important insights. They contain the emotions you may have avoided, the questions you never allowed yourself to explore, and the understanding that grows only when the mind becomes quiet enough to listen. Solitude allows these layers to surface gently. For example, you may begin noticing how certain experiences from the past still influence your present reactions. A small moment of reflection may reveal how a past disappointment shaped the way you approach new opportunities. Another moment of awareness may reveal how a fear of failure quietly influenced decisions you once believed were logical. These insights do not appear to criticize you. Instead, they help you understand yourself more clearly. The more you observe these patterns, the more compassion you develop for your own journey. You begin seeing that every reaction, every decision, and every belief was shaped by a combination of experiences and circumstances. This understanding softens the harsh self-judgment that many people carry. Instead of constantly criticizing yourself for mistakes or weaknesses, you begin recognizing the human process of learning and growth. Solitude nurtures this compassion because it gives you the time to observe your inner world without pressure or comparison. In everyday life, people often measure themselves against others. They compare achievements, lifestyles, and progress. These comparisons can easily create feelings of inadequacy or competition. But in solitude, comparison fades. There is no one else to measure yourself against. There is only the quiet relationship between you and your own awareness. This relationship becomes incredibly valuable. When you regularly spend time returning to yourself, you begin developing a deeper sense of trust in your own understanding. Instead of constantly seeking external confirmation, you begin listening to the wisdom that arises from within your reflection. This does not mean ignoring advice or rejecting the perspectives of others. Instead, it means that your decisions are guided by a balanced awareness, rather than by external pressure alone. Solitude also helps you reconnect with your deeper values. During busy periods of life, it is easy to lose sight of what truly matters. People become focused on solving immediate problems and meeting expectations. Over time, the larger questions about meaning and purpose may fade into the background, but when you sit quietly with yourself, these questions often reappear. You may begin asking yourself what kind of person you want to become. You may reflect on the qualities that truly matter to you, such as kindness, patience, honesty, or wisdom. These reflections gradually influence the way you live. Instead of allowing circumstances alone to determine your actions, you begin aligning your choices with the values you recognize as important. This alignment creates a sense of integrity. Integrity means that your thoughts, values, and actions move in the same direction. When a person lives with integrity, they feel less inner conflict because their behavior reflects their deeper understanding. Solitude strengthens this alignment. Each time you return to yourself in quiet reflection, you reinforce your awareness of what matters most. Another beautiful aspect of solitude is the way it restores emotional balance. In busy environments, emotions can easily become intensified by constant interaction. Stress, frustration, and excitement move quickly through conversations and responsibilities. But in solitude, emotions have space to settle. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind begins observing feelings with patience. You may notice sadness appearing, then gradually softening. You may observe frustration fading as the mind relaxes. Through this observation, you learn that emotions are not permanent states. They are temporary movements within awareness. This realization creates emotional resilience. Instead of fearing your emotions or trying to suppress them, you learn how to experience them with understanding. Solitude also restores the simple joy of being present. When the mind is not chasing distractions, it becomes capable of appreciating the quiet richness of ordinary moments. The rhythm of breathing, the sensation of stillness, and the calm awareness of existence become meaningful experiences rather than empty spaces. This appreciation for simplicity changes the way you experience life. You begin realizing that fulfillment does not always require dramatic achievements or constant stimulation. Sometimes it arises from the quiet connection with your own awareness. Over time, the practice of returning to yourself becomes a form of inner sanctuary. No matter how busy or challenging life becomes, you know that you can step into solitude and reconnect with your deeper understanding. This sanctuary is always available because it exists within your own awareness. Buddhist teachings often remind us that peace does not come from controlling every external condition. Instead, peace emerges when the mind learns how to return to its natural clarity. Solitude teaches this return. It reminds you that beneath the noise of responsibilities and expectations, there is a calm presence that remains steady. Each time you return to this presence, you strengthen your relationship with yourself. You become more aware, more compassionate, and more aligned with your values. And gradually you realize that the most important journey you will ever take is not a journey across the world. It is the journey of returning to yourself again and again, until the quiet wisdom of your own mind becomes the guide for your life. 16. Solitude reveals the quiet power of inner freedom. There is a kind of freedom that most people spend their entire lives searching for without fully understanding what it means. Many believe freedom comes from having more options, more success, more control over circumstances, or more recognition from others. They imagine that once life finally reaches a certain point, once the right conditions appear, they will feel free to live exactly as they wish. But as years pass, many discover that even when circumstances improve, the feeling of inner freedom remains fragile. New responsibilities appear, new expectations arise, and the mind continues feeling bound by worries, comparisons, and the constant pressure to maintain a certain image. Solitude slowly reveals a different kind of freedom. When a person steps away from the endless movement of everyday life and spends time alone with their thoughts, something subtle begins to appear. At first, it may simply feel like relief from constant noise. The mind has fewer demands placed upon it, fewer conversations to navigate, and fewer expectations to respond to. But if the person remains in solitude long enough, they begin noticing something deeper then relief. They begin noticing space. This space does not exist in the outside world. It exists within the mind itself. It is the space between thoughts, the pause before a reaction, the quiet awareness that observes everything without immediately becoming entangled in it. Most people move through life without recognizing this inner space because their thoughts are constantly pulling them into reactions. A situation occurs, and the mind immediately interprets it. Someone says something unexpected, and the mind quickly forms a judgment or emotional response. A challenge appears, and the mind instantly begins worrying about outcomes. This pattern creates a feeling of mental confinement. The mind feels controlled by its own reactions. Solitude begins loosening this confinement. When the mind is no longer constantly responding to the outside world, it becomes easier to notice the difference between awareness and reaction. A thought may appear, but instead of immediately believing or following it, the mind begins observing it. You may notice a worry about the future appearing in your thoughts. In the past, that worry might have triggered a chain of anxious thinking. But in solitude, you begin recognizing that the worry is simply a thought moving through awareness. It arises, stays briefly, and then fades away. This observation creates a powerful realization. Thoughts do not have to control you. They only gain power when you automatically follow them. The moment you recognize that a thought is simply a mental event rather than an absolute truth, the relationship between you and your mind begins changing. This is where inner freedom begins. Inner freedom does not mean eliminating thoughts or emotions. The human mind will always produce thoughts. Emotions will always arise in response to experiences. But solitude teaches you that you are not required to react to every mental movement. There is space between the experience and the reaction. In that space, awareness has the ability to choose. Buddhist teachings often describe this understanding as one of the most important insights on the path to wisdom. The mind suffers when it becomes trapped inside automatic reactions. But when awareness develops, the mind gains the ability to pause, observe, and respond with clarity. Solitude strengthens this awareness because it slows down the rhythm of mental activity. Without constant distractions, the mind becomes more sensitive to its own movements. You begin noticing the moment a thought begins forming. You recognize the emotional shift that accompanies certain ideas. Instead of being carried away by these movements, you remain present with them. This presence creates a sense of spaciousness in your mind. Thoughts still appear, but they feel less overwhelming. Emotions still arise, but they no longer feel like forces that must be obeyed immediately. Over time, this spacious awareness becomes one of the greatest sources of inner freedom. You begin realizing that many of the limitations you once believed were imposed by the world were actually created by your own unconscious reactions. For example, someone might criticize you, and in the past, your mind might have instantly reacted with defensiveness or self-doubt. But through the awareness developed in solitude, you begin noticing the reaction as it arises. Instead of immediately responding, you pause. You observe the emotional response. And in that moment of observation, you discover that the reaction is not inevitable. You can choose how to respond. This ability to choose creates a profound shift in how you experience life. Instead of feeling controlled by circumstances, you begin feeling capable of navigating them with awareness. Another important aspect of inner freedom is the release of unnecessary mental burdens. Many people carry invisible weights throughout their lives. They hold on to regrets from the past, worries about the future, and endless comparisons with others. These mental burdens often feel unavoidable because the mind believes they are necessary for growth or protection. But solitude reveals that much of this mental weight is optional. As you observe your thoughts carefully, you begin noticing how often the mind revisits situations that no longer exist. It replays past events again and again, as if repeating them might somehow change what happened. But through awareness, you begin recognizing that these repetitions only create suffering in the present moment. Once this realization becomes clear, letting go becomes easier. Not because you force yourself to forget the past, but because you see that holding on to it no longer serves you. This release creates a lighter state of mind. The mind becomes less crowded with unnecessary worries. Instead of constantly carrying the weight of past mistakes or imagined futures, you begin returning to the present moment, where life is actually unfolding. Solitude also reveals the freedom that comes from reducing attachment to external validation. In social environments, people often shape their behavior based on how they believe others will perceive them. They adjust their words, actions, and even their beliefs to fit expectations. While some level of adaptation is natural, excessive dependence on approval can quietly imprison the mind. When a person constantly worries about how others see them, their freedom becomes limited by those perceptions. Solitude reduces this dependence. When you spend time alone, you begin experiencing life without the constant mirror of other people's reactions. You begin noticing how your thoughts and actions feel when they are not shaped by external judgment. This experience can be incredibly liberating. You realize that much of the pressure you once felt was created by the mind's anticipation of others' opinions. Without that anticipation, your natural thoughts and preferences begin appearing more clearly. This clarity allows you to act more authentically. Instead of constantly trying to maintain an image, you begin expressing yourself with greater honesty. This authenticity is another form of inner freedom. It allows you to live according to your values rather than constantly adjusting yourself to fit every expectation. Solitude also deepens your understanding of acceptance. Inner freedom does not mean controlling every aspect of life. It means recognizing that many things exist beyond your control and learning how to respond to them with calm awareness. When the mind accepts this reality, it stops fighting unnecessary battles. It stops trying to control every outcome. Instead, it focuses on the one thing that always remains within reach: the quality of your awareness. Buddhist philosophy often teaches that freedom arises when the mind learns to release its constant resistance to life. Solitude makes this lesson visible. In the quiet space of reflection, you begin noticing how much tension was created by resisting things you could not change. As acceptance grows, that tension dissolves. The mind becomes more relaxed, more open, and more resilient. This resilience is another form of freedom. It means that even when life presents challenges, your inner stability remains intact. You may experience disappointment or uncertainty, but your peace is no longer completely dependent on circumstances. Solitude teaches that this peace has always existed within you. It simply required the quiet space of awareness to be recognized. Over time, the practice of solitude becomes more than just spending time alone. It becomes a training ground for inner freedom. Each moment of reflection strengthens your ability to observe your mind. Each insight deepens your understanding of how thoughts and reactions shape your experience. And gradually, the boundaries that once limited your sense of freedom begin dissolving. You begin living with a greater sense of openness. You become less afraid of uncertainty. You move through life with the quiet confidence that comes from understanding your own mind. This is the freedom solitude reveals. Not a freedom dependent on perfect circumstances, but a freedom that arises from awareness itself. And once this freedom becomes part of your experience, you carry it with you wherever you go, because it was never something the world needed to give you. It was always something waiting to be discovered within your own mind. 17. Solitude awakens the wisdom to see life clearly. There comes a stage in the journey of solitude where the mind begins developing a deeper form of wisdom. This wisdom is not simply the result of reading books, hearing teachings, or collecting information. It emerges from direct observation of life and the quiet understanding that grows when the mind has the space to reflect. Many people move through life reacting quickly to situations without truly seeing them clearly. Thoughts arise, emotions follow, and decisions are made in the middle of mental noise. Because everything moves so fast, there is rarely enough time to step back and observe what is actually happening beneath the surface. Solitude creates the environment where this observation becomes possible. When you spend time alone and allow the mind to settle, the constant stream of stimulation begins to slow. Without the pressure to respond immediately to conversations or external demands, the mind becomes more attentive. It begins noticing details that were previously overlooked. Thoughts appear more clearly, emotions become easier to understand, and patterns in behavior begin revealing themselves. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that wisdom begins with awareness. Awareness means seeing things as they truly are, rather than as the mind automatically interprets them. In everyday life, the mind often jumps to conclusions quickly. A small event may trigger strong assumptions. A misunderstanding may immediately create anger or fear. These reactions happen so quickly that they feel almost automatic. But in solitude, the mind gains the time needed to observe these reactions. You may notice how a simple thought can grow into a powerful emotional response if it is not recognized early. You may observe how certain expectations influence the way you interpret situations. When the mind becomes aware of these patterns, it begins understanding that many of its reactions were based on interpretations rather than reality. This understanding gradually develops into wisdom. Wisdom does not eliminate emotions or thoughts. Instead, it changes the way the mind relates to them. When wisdom grows, the mind becomes less likely to react impulsively. Instead of immediately believing every thought that appears, you begin examining it more carefully. For example, imagine that someone behaves in a way that feels dismissive or disrespectful. In a busy environment, the mind might immediately react with anger or hurt. The situation may escalate quickly because the mind assumes it understands the other person's intentions. But solitude trains the mind to pause. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin asking questions within your awareness. Is the interpretation accurate? Could there be another explanation? Is this situation as serious as the mind is making it appear? End quote. These small pauses create space for clarity. Often, the situation turns out to be less dramatic than the mind originally imagined. The emotional intensity begins softening, and a more balanced understanding appears. Through repeated experiences like this, the mind begins learning how easily it can be misled by its own assumptions. Solitude also strengthens the ability to see the impermanent nature of experiences. Everything in life is constantly changing. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, and circumstances evolve over time. Yet when the mind is caught in a strong emotional reaction, it often forgets this truth. In the middle of anger or fear, the situation can feel permanent and overwhelming. But solitude helps reveal the temporary nature of these states. When you observe your thoughts and emotions during quiet reflection, you begin noticing how they naturally move and shift. A feeling that once seemed intense gradually fades when the mind stops feeding it with constant attention. This observation builds patience. Instead of rushing to escape uncomfortable emotions, you learn to sit with them and watch how they transform. Over time, this patience reduces the fear of emotional discomfort. You begin trusting that difficult feelings will pass, just as pleasant feelings eventually fade as well. This understanding creates emotional stability. When the mind knows that experiences are temporary, it becomes less attached to extreme reactions. Joy can be appreciated without clinging to it, and sadness can be experienced without believing it will last forever. Solitude also deepens the understanding of cause and effect in life. Every action, thought, and decision creates consequences that influence future experiences. In a busy environment, these connections are often difficult to notice because events move too quickly. But in solitude, the mind can reflect on how past choices shaped the present moment. You may begin recognizing how certain habits influenced your well-being. For instance, you might notice how moments of kindness improved relationships, while moments of impatience created tension. You may see how consistent effort gradually produced growth, even if the progress was not obvious at the time. These observations strengthen responsibility. Instead of viewing life as a series of random events, you begin recognizing the role your own actions play in shaping your experiences. This realization does not create blame or guilt. Instead, it empowers you to make more thoughtful choices moving forward. Wisdom grows when the mind understands that every moment offers an opportunity to act with greater awareness. Solitude also sharpens the ability to distinguish between what truly matters and what is merely noise. In everyday life, people are constantly exposed to information that demands attention. News, social media, opinions, and endless conversations create the impression that every issue is urgent and important. But when you spend time alone, the mind begins filtering this information more carefully. You start noticing which concerns genuinely deserve your attention and which ones are simply distractions. Many worries that once felt urgent may appear less significant when viewed from a calm perspective. This clarity allows you to focus your energy on what truly matters. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by countless minor concerns, you begin prioritizing actions and relationships that align with your deeper values. Solitude also nurtures humility. As awareness deepens, the mind begins recognizing how complex life truly is. Situations that once seemed simple reveal deeper layers of meaning. You realize that every person you encounter carries their own experiences, fears, hopes, and struggles. This understanding softens judgment. Instead of quickly labeling others as right or wrong, you become more curious about their perspective. Compassion grows because you recognize that everyone is navigating their own journey through life. Buddhist wisdom often describes compassion and wisdom as two qualities that grow together. As understanding deepens, empathy naturally expands. Solitude provides the quiet environment where both qualities can develop. Another transformation that occurs through solitude is the ability to listen more carefully. In everyday conversation, many people focus more on preparing their response than on truly hearing what others are saying. But when the mind becomes calmer through reflection, listening becomes more genuine. You become more attentive to the emotions behind words, more patient with silence, and more respectful of perspectives different from your own. This deeper listening improves relationships because people feel understood rather than judged. Wisdom gained in solitude therefore extends into the way you interact with others. You respond more thoughtfully, communicate more clearly, and approach disagreements with greater patience. Over time, the accumulation of these insights transforms the way you experience life. Situations that once felt chaotic begin appearing more understandable. Emotional reactions become less overwhelming because the mind has learned how to observe them. Challenges still occur, but they are approached with greater clarity. Success still brings joy, but it no longer becomes the sole source of happiness. Solitude does not remove the complexity of life, but it equips the mind with the awareness needed to navigate that complexity wisely. Through reflection, observation, and patience, the mind develops a deeper understanding of itself and the world around it. This understanding is the essence of wisdom. And once wisdom begins guiding your actions, life becomes less about reacting to circumstances and more about responding with clarity, compassion, and thoughtful awareness. Solitude therefore becomes more than a temporary escape from noise. It becomes the quiet teacher that gradually reveals the wisdom already waiting within the human mind. 18. Solitude helps you transform pain into understanding. One of the most profound gifts that solitude offers is the ability to transform pain into understanding. Every human life contains moments of difficulty. There are experiences that leave emotional marks on the mind: disappointment, rejection, loss, failure, misunderstanding, and moments when life simply does not unfold the way we hoped it would. These experiences are part of being human, yet most people rarely have the opportunity to truly understand them. Instead, they move quickly from one event to the next, carrying the emotional weight of past experiences without fully examining what those experiences were trying to teach them. In everyday life, pain is often pushed aside rather than explored. When something difficult happens, the mind instinctively tries to escape the discomfort. People distract themselves with work, entertainment, or constant activity. They may talk about the situation repeatedly, hoping that conversation alone will relieve the emotional tension. But while these strategies may temporarily reduce the discomfort, they often prevent the deeper understanding that could transform the experience. Solitude changes this process. When a person spends time alone, away from distractions and constant stimulation, the mind begins creating space for reflection. Memories that once felt confusing or overwhelming begin appearing again in awareness, but this time the mind observes them from a calmer distance. Instead of reacting immediately with anger, sadness, or frustration, the mind becomes curious. Why did this situation affect me so strongly? What expectations was I holding at that time? What did I learn from that experience? These questions begin opening the door to understanding. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that suffering can become a powerful teacher when it is observed with awareness. According to Buddhist philosophy, pain itself is not the primary source of suffering. The deeper suffering often arises from resistance, the mind's attempt to deny, avoid, or fight against what has already happened. Solitude allows the mind to stop resisting. In the quiet space of reflection, you begin allowing memories and emotions to exist without immediately trying to push them away. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the mind has been trained to escape painful feelings. But when you remain present with the experience, something remarkable begins to happen. The emotional intensity gradually softens. A memory that once felt overwhelming begins losing its sharp edges. Instead of reliving the pain exactly as it was, the mind begins observing the experience with a wider perspective. This perspective reveals lessons that were previously hidden. For example, a moment of rejection may have once felt like a personal failure. But through reflection and solitude, you may begin recognizing that the rejection guided you toward a different path that ultimately suited you better. What once appeared as a loss may later reveal itself as a redirection. Similarly, a difficult relationship may have left emotional scars, but solitude allows you to examine the experience more deeply. You may begin seeing patterns in your expectations, communication, or emotional responses that you had never noticed before. These insights are not meant to assign blame to yourself or others. Instead, they help you understand how experiences shape growth. Through this process, pain begins transforming into wisdom. Another important aspect of solitude is that it allows emotions to move naturally through awareness. Many people fear their emotions because they believe that feeling sadness, anger, or grief will trap them in suffering forever. However, when emotions are allowed to be experienced with awareness, they often follow a natural cycle. They arise, they express themselves, and eventually they fade. Solitude gives these emotions the quiet space they need to complete this cycle. For example, when sadness appears, the mind often tries to escape it by distracting itself. But when you remain present with the feeling, you may notice that sadness has a rhythm. It rises, reaches a peak, and gradually dissolves when it is no longer resisted. Through repeated experiences like this, the mind begins trusting its own ability to process emotions. Instead of fearing pain, you begin understanding it. Buddhist philosophy teaches that awareness brings transformation. When a person sees their experiences clearly, they begin freeing themselves from the unconscious patterns that once controlled their reactions. Solitude supports this awareness. In the quiet space of reflection, you begin noticing how certain painful experiences shaped your beliefs about yourself or the world. Perhaps a past failure created a belief that you were not capable enough. Perhaps a moment of betrayal created a fear of trusting others. These beliefs often remain hidden beneath the surface of everyday thinking, but solitude allows them to appear. Once they become visible, they can be examined. You may realize that the belief you carried for years was based on a single moment rather than on your full potential. You may recognize that your fear of trust was protecting you from pain, but also preventing meaningful connections. Through this understanding, the mind begins releasing the grip of old narratives. The painful experience no longer defines you. Instead, it becomes part of a larger story of learning and growth. Solitude also encourages compassion toward yourself. Many people judge themselves harshly for past mistakes or difficult emotions. They believe they should have acted differently or handled situations more perfectly. This self-criticism can create an additional layer of suffering on top of the original pain. But when you observe your past experiences in solitude, you begin seeing them through a more compassionate lens. You recognize that at that moment in your life, you were responding with the understanding and emotional resources you had available at the time. You did the best you could with the awareness you had. This realization softens self-judgment. Instead of punishing yourself for past actions, you begin appreciating how each experience contributed to your growth. Another powerful transformation that solitude encourages is forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean approving of harmful actions or pretending that painful events were acceptable. Instead, it means releasing the emotional grip that those events continue to hold over your present moment. Through reflection, you may begin seeing that holding on to anger or resentment does not actually change the past. It simply continues the suffering in your own mind. As awareness deepens, the mind gradually loosens its attachment to those emotions. Forgiveness becomes possible not because the past was fair, but because you recognize that your peace is more valuable than continuing the cycle of resentment. Solitude helps create the mental clarity needed for this release. Over time, painful experiences begin appearing in a new light. Instead of seeing them only as wounds, you begin recognizing the strength and insight they help develop. Challenges that once felt like obstacles may reveal themselves as turning points that redirected your life in meaningful ways. This perspective does not deny the difficulty of the experience. It simply acknowledges that growth often emerges from moments that initially appear painful. Buddhist teachings often remind us that lotus flowers grow from muddy water. In the same way, wisdom often grows from experiences that once felt confusing or difficult. Solitude becomes the environment where this transformation takes place. In the quiet space of reflection, pain is no longer something to escape. It becomes something to understand. And through understanding, it gradually transforms into insight, compassion, and inner strength. Over time, this transformation changes the way you approach future challenges. Instead of fearing pain as something destructive, you begin seeing it as a signal inviting deeper awareness. Difficult moments still appear in life, but they no longer feel like permanent obstacles. They become part of the unfolding journey of growth. Solitude, therefore, reveals one of the most important truths about human experience. Pain does not have to remain suffering. When it is met with awareness, patience, and understanding, it can become one of the most powerful teachers on the path of wisdom. And through the quiet space of solitude, the mind learns how to listen to that teacher with clarity and compassion. 19. Solitude awakens a deep compassion for yourself and others. One of the most beautiful transformations that begins to unfold through solitude is the awakening of compassion. Many people believe compassion only grows through interaction with others, through kindness, generosity, and empathy in relationships. While these expressions are certainly important, true compassion often begins much deeper within the mind itself. It grows from understanding, and understanding grows from awareness. Solitude provides the quiet space where this awareness can develop, allowing a person to see themselves and others with greater clarity and kindness. In everyday life, people often move quickly from one situation to another without fully processing their emotional experiences. Conversations happen, misunderstandings occur, stress builds, and the mind reacts automatically. Because everything moves so quickly, there is rarely time to step back and observe the deeper patterns behind these reactions. When emotions such as frustration, jealousy, or anger arise, people often respond to them without understanding where they truly come from. Solitude changes this dynamic. When you spend time alone and allow your mind to slow down, you begin noticing the emotions that move through your inner world. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin observing them carefully. Perhaps you notice a feeling of irritation towards someone. In the past, you might have simply accepted the irritation as justified, but in solitude, the mind begins asking deeper questions. Why did this reaction appear? What expectation was behind it? What fear or insecurity might be influencing this feeling? As these questions emerge, something important begins to happen. You start seeing that your emotional reactions are often connected to deeper experiences and beliefs. A moment of frustration might be connected to a fear of not being respected. A feeling of jealousy might be connected to an insecurity about your own worth. A moment of anger might be connected to an expectation that reality should behave differently than it did. When these connections become visible, the mind begins softening. Instead of judging yourself harshly for experiencing these emotions, you begin understanding them. You recognize that your mind was responding based on past experiences, learned habits, and natural human vulnerability. This understanding is the beginning of self-compassion. Self-compassion means treating yourself with the same kindness and patience that you would offer to someone you care about deeply. Instead of constantly criticizing yourself for every mistake or emotional reaction, you begin recognizing that being human includes imperfection. Buddhist teachings emphasize that suffering is a universal part of human experience. Every person faces challenges, uncertainties, and moments of emotional pain. When you truly understand this, you begin seeing your own struggles with greater gentleness. Solitude supports this realization because it allows you to observe your inner life without the pressure of comparison. In social environments, people often feel the need to present a strong image. They hide vulnerabilities and emphasize achievements. This can create the illusion that everyone else has life perfectly under control. But in solitude, you see the full range of your own humanity. You see moments of strength and moments of weakness. You see courage and doubt existing side by side. Through this observation, you begin recognizing that these contradictions are part of being human rather than signs of failure. This realization opens the door to deeper compassion. Once you understand your own struggles more clearly, it becomes easier to understand the struggles of others. Solitude helps reveal that every person you encounter is navigating their own internal world. Just as you have fears, insecurities, hopes, and disappointments, so does everyone else. The person who speaks harshly may be carrying unresolved pain. The person who appears distant may be protecting themselves from vulnerability. The person who seems confident may still be quietly wrestling with self-doubt. This awareness changes the way you interpret other people's actions. Instead of reacting immediately with judgment, you begin approaching situations with curiosity and empathy. When someone behaves negatively, you may still set healthy boundaries, but you also recognize that their behavior is often shaped by their own experiences and struggles. Compassion does not mean accepting harmful behavior without limits. Instead, it means understanding that human actions are rarely as simple as they appear on the surface. Solitude deepens this understanding because it allows you to reflect on your own life more honestly. You remember times when you reacted poorly because you were overwhelmed. You remember moments when fear influenced your decisions or when insecurity shaped your words. These memories remind you that growth is an ongoing process. No one moves through life perfectly. Recognizing this shared human vulnerability naturally expands your compassion toward others. Another transformation that occurs through solitude is the softening of rigid judgments. In busy environments, the mind often categorizes people quickly. Someone may be labeled as difficult, irresponsible, selfish, or careless based on a single interaction. These judgments may feel justified in the moment, but they rarely capture the full complexity of another person's life. When the mind becomes more reflective through solitude, it begins questioning these quick conclusions. You start recognizing that every person's behavior emerges from a unique combination of experiences, emotions, and circumstances. This understanding does not mean ignoring harmful actions, but it does encourage a more balanced perspective. Instead of reducing people to simple labels, you begin seeing them as complex individuals navigating their own challenges. Buddhist philosophy often describes compassion as a natural outcome of wisdom. When awareness deepens and understanding expands, the heart naturally becomes more open. Solitude nurtures both of these qualities. It strengthens awareness by slowing down the mind and allowing it to observe its patterns. It strengthens wisdom by revealing the deeper causes behind emotions and actions. As awareness and wisdom grow together, compassion naturally follows. Another powerful aspect of compassion developed through solitude is patience. In a world that often moves quickly and demands immediate results, patience can feel rare. People expect themselves and others to change instantly, improve instantly, and behave perfectly at all times. But solitude reminds you that growth takes time. Just as your own understanding developed gradually through reflection and experience, the growth of others follows its own pace. Recognizing this allows you to interact with greater patience and understanding. You become less likely to react impulsively to mistakes or misunderstandings. Instead, you respond with calmness and clarity. Solitude also encourages acts of kindness. When the mind becomes more aware of the shared human experience of struggle and growth, the desire to contribute positively to the lives of others naturally increases. Kindness becomes less about obligation and more about genuine connection. Small gestures begin feeling meaningful. A moment of listening, a word of encouragement, or a simple act of generosity carries greater depth because it arises from genuine compassion rather than from social expectation. Over time, the compassion developed in solitude transforms the way you move through the world. You become more understanding of your own imperfections. You become more patient with the imperfections of others. Conflicts are approached with greater clarity. Relationships are guided by empathy rather than by quick judgment. And perhaps most importantly, you begin recognizing that compassion is not something you must force. It is something that naturally emerges when awareness deepens. Solitude reveals that beneath the layers of fear, insecurity, and misunderstanding, the human heart is naturally capable of kindness. When the mind becomes quiet enough to observe life clearly, this kindness begins flowing naturally into both your relationship with yourself and your relationship with the world. In this way, solitude becomes not a withdrawal from humanity, but a deeper connection to it. By understanding yourself more clearly, you learn how to understand others. And through that understanding, compassion quietly becomes one of the most powerful forces shaping your life. 20. Solitude reveals that peace has always been within you. After walking through the long journey of solitude, reflection, awareness, and understanding, there comes a final realization that quietly changes the way a person sees life. This realization does not arrive suddenly like a dramatic discovery. Instead, it appears gradually through many small moments of silence, many observations of the mind, and many reflections on life's experiences. Over time, a person begins to see something that was always present but rarely noticed before. Peace was never something that needed to be chased in the outside world. It was always quietly waiting within. For most of their lives, people search for peace in external conditions. They believe that once their problems are solved, once their goals are achieved, or once life becomes stable and predictable, peace will finally appear. This belief shapes countless decisions. People work harder, chase recognition, pursue relationships, accumulate achievements, and attempt to build the perfect circumstances that will allow them to feel calm and satisfied. Yet even when some of these goals are achieved, the peace they hoped for often feels temporary. A moment of success may bring happiness, but the mind soon begins chasing the next goal. A relationship may provide comfort, but new expectations eventually appear. A period of stability may feel satisfying, but life inevitably changes again. Through solitude, the mind begins recognizing this pattern. In the quiet space of reflection, you begin seeing how often the mind was searching for peace somewhere in the future. It imagined that fulfillment would arrive once certain conditions were met. But while waiting for that future moment, the present moment was often overlooked. Solitude gently brings attention back to the present. When you sit quietly and observe your thoughts without chasing them, something subtle becomes visible. Beneath the movement of thinking, beneath the emotional reactions and expectations, there is a quiet awareness that remains steady. This awareness is calm. It is not disturbed by every passing thought. It does not depend on perfect circumstances. It simply observes. At first, this awareness may appear only briefly. You may notice a few seconds of stillness between thoughts. In those moments, the mind feels clear and relaxed. There is nothing to prove, nothing to chase, and nothing to fix. There is simply presence. Through repeated experiences of solitude, these moments of stillness begin lasting longer. The mind becomes more familiar with its own quiet nature. Instead of constantly searching for stimulation, it begins appreciating the calm clarity of awareness itself. This is where the deepest understanding begins to emerge. Peace is not something that must be created. It is something that appears naturally when the mind stops disturbing itself. Buddhist teachings often describe this insight as discovering the natural state of the mind. Just as the sky remains vast and open even when clouds pass through it, the mind has a natural clarity that exists beneath its thoughts and emotions. Thoughts are like clouds moving through the sky of awareness. They appear, they change shape, and eventually they disappear. But the sky itself remains. Solitude allows you to see this directly. When the mind is no longer constantly distracted, it becomes easier to recognize that thoughts are temporary events rather than permanent realities. A worry about the future appears, but if you observe it without feeding it, it fades. A memory from the past arises, but it eventually dissolves when attention returns to the present moment. Through this observation, the mind begins trusting its own ability to remain calm. Instead of believing that peace depends on controlling every situation, you begin understanding that peace comes from observing life with awareness. This realization changes the way you approach the world. Challenges still appear, but they no longer destroy your inner balance. Success still brings joy, but it no longer becomes the sole source of happiness. Relationships remain important, but your sense of self is no longer entirely dependent on them. You begin moving through life with a quieter confidence. This confidence is not based on external achievements. It is based on the understanding that your inner awareness remains stable even when circumstances change. Solitude also reveals the beauty of simplicity. In a world filled with constant stimulation, people often believe that happiness requires excitement, novelty, and endless activity. But when the mind becomes quieter through reflection, it begins appreciating the richness of simple moments. The sound of the wind moving through trees, the rhythm of your breathing, the quiet presence of stillness. These moments begin carrying a sense of peace that once seemed impossible to find. You realize that the mind had been overlooking these experiences because it was always searching for something more dramatic or impressive. But peace often lives in simplicity. Solitude helps you rediscover this simplicity. Another important transformation that occurs through solitude is the release of unnecessary struggle. For many people, life feels like a constant effort to control every outcome. They try to predict the future, manage every detail, and ensure that nothing unexpected disrupts their plans. But through reflection, the mind begins recognizing that much of this struggle creates unnecessary tension. Life naturally contains uncertainty and change. Trying to eliminate every possibility of difficulty is impossible. Solitude reveals that peace does not require perfect control. It requires acceptance. Acceptance does not mean giving up or becoming passive. Instead, it means recognizing that some aspects of life are beyond personal control and learning how to respond to them with awareness rather than resistance. When the mind accepts this reality, it becomes lighter. Energy that was once spent fighting the flow of life becomes available for understanding it. Solitude also reveals the quiet joy of simply being alive. When the mind stops chasing constant stimulation, it becomes more sensitive to the experience of existence itself. The simple fact of breathing, sensing, and being aware becomes meaningful. This appreciation does not depend on extraordinary circumstances. It arises naturally when the mind becomes present. Over time, the insights gained through solitude begin shaping the way you live. You become less reactive to small disturbances. You become more patient with uncertainty. You approach life with curiosity rather than constant judgment. And most importantly, you recognize that the peace you were searching for was never hidden somewhere in the future. It was always present within the quiet awareness of your own mind. Solitude helped reveal this truth. By stepping away from the noise of the world, you learned how to listen to the deeper silence within yourself. That silence contains clarity. It contains wisdom. And it contains a peace that does not depend on external conditions. Once you discover this peace, life begins feeling less like a struggle and more like a journey of awareness. You continue moving forward, learning, growing, and experiencing the world. But beneath every experience, there remains a quiet understanding. The understanding that peace was never something the world needed to give you. It was something you simply needed the silence to recognize. 21. Solitude teaches you to see through the illusions of the mind. As a person spends more time in solitude and continues observing the movement of their thoughts, a powerful realization slowly begins to emerge. The mind that once felt like an unquestionable authority begins revealing something unexpected. Many of the things it once presented as absolute truths are not truths at all. They are interpretations, assumptions, fears, and habits that were formed over time. These mental constructions often feel real simply because they have been repeated so many times that the mind accepts them without question. Solitude becomes the place where these illusions slowly begin to dissolve. In everyday life, people rarely notice how much of their experience is shaped by these mental interpretations. A small event occurs, and the mind instantly assigns meaning to it. Someone might fail to return a message, and the mind may quickly conclude that they are ignoring or disrespecting you. A challenge might appear at work, and the mind might immediately believe that failure is inevitable. These reactions happen so quickly that they appear natural, almost automatic. But when a person spends time alone and begins watching their thoughts carefully, something important becomes visible. The mind does not simply observe reality, it constantly adds stories to what it sees. These stories shape emotions, decisions, and beliefs about life. Buddhist philosophy often describes this process as the mind's tendency to create illusions. An illusion does not necessarily mean something completely false. Instead, it means that the mind's interpretation is incomplete or distorted. The mind fills in gaps with assumptions based on past experiences, fears, and expectations. Solitude helps reveal this process. When you sit quietly and observe your thoughts without immediately reacting to them, you begin noticing how quickly the mind forms conclusions. A thought appears, and the mind treats it as if it were a fact. But with awareness, you start asking deeper questions. Is this thought actually true? What evidence supports it? Could there be another explanation? These questions create space between you and your thoughts. That space is incredibly important because it allows you to see that many thoughts are not accurate reflections of reality. They are interpretations shaped by past experiences. For example, someone who once experienced rejection may develop a habit of expecting rejection in future interactions. The mind may automatically assume that others will respond negatively, even when there is no clear evidence. This expectation can create unnecessary anxiety and hesitation. Solitude allows you to observe this pattern. You begin recognizing that the fear of rejection is not necessarily based on the present situation, but on memories from the past. Once you see this clearly, the illusion begins weakening. Another common illusion the mind creates is the belief that happiness exists somewhere in the future. The mind often says, once I achieve this goal, then I will finally feel satisfied. It may believe that happiness will come from a promotion, a relationship, financial security, or recognition. While these achievements may bring temporary joy, solitude reveals how the mind quickly shifts its focus to the next desire. The satisfaction fades, and a new goal appears. Through reflection, you begin seeing that the mind is constantly chasing something that feels just slightly out of reach. This realization can be both surprising and liberating. It shows that the mind's promise of future happiness may be another illusion. Happiness may not be something waiting at the end of a long chain of achievements. Instead, it may arise when the mind stops chasing and becomes present with what already exists. Solitude also reveals illusions related to identity. Many people carry strong beliefs about who they are. They may believe they are not intelligent enough, not capable enough, or not worthy of success. These beliefs often form through repeated experiences or messages received during childhood or difficult moments in life. Over time, these beliefs become part of the mind's narrative. The mind begins repeating them automatically. But solitude allows you to observe these beliefs more carefully. You may notice that the belief, I am not capable, appears as a thought rather than as an objective fact. When you examine it closely, you may realize that it originated from a specific experience rather than from a complete understanding of your abilities. This observation weakens the illusion. Instead of accepting the belief as permanent truth, you begin seeing it as a mental pattern that can change. Solitude helps expose another powerful illusion, the belief that control brings security. Many people try to control every detail of their lives in order to avoid uncertainty. They plan carefully, anticipate possible problems, and attempt to predict outcomes. While some planning is useful, the illusion lies in believing that complete control is possible. Life is inherently unpredictable. Circumstances change, people behave in unexpected ways, and events unfold beyond personal control. Through solitude, the mind begins recognizing how much tension was created by trying to control everything. You may notice that the more tightly the mind tried to control outcomes, the more anxious it became when reality did not follow those expectations. This realization leads to a deeper understanding. Security does not come from controlling every possibility. It comes from developing the ability to respond to uncertainty with awareness and flexibility. Solitude reveals another subtle illusion related to comparison. In social environments, people constantly measure themselves against others. They compare achievements, appearances, lifestyles, and progress. This comparison often creates the feeling that someone else's life is better or more successful. But solitude changes the perspective. When the mind is no longer surrounded by constant images and opinions, it becomes easier to recognize that comparison is based on incomplete information. You rarely see the full story of another person's life. You see moments of success, but you do not see the struggles behind them. Through reflection, you begin realizing that every person carries their own challenges and uncertainties. Comparison loses its power because you understand that each journey is unique. Another illusion the mind creates is the belief that emotions define reality. When you feel angry, the situation may appear unfair. When you feel anxious, the future may appear threatening. But solitude teaches you to observe emotions rather than immediately believing the stories they create. You begin noticing that emotions are temporary waves moving through awareness. They influence perception, but they do not always represent objective truth. This understanding allows you to respond more calmly. Instead of reacting immediately to emotional impulses, you pause and observe them. That pause often reveals a more balanced perspective. Solitude gradually dissolves these illusions one by one. The mind becomes more curious about its own patterns. Instead of blindly following every thought, you begin examining it. Instead of assuming every emotional reaction is justified, you observe it with patience. This process leads to clarity. Clarity does not mean that the mind stops producing thoughts or emotions. It means that awareness becomes strong enough to see through them. You begin recognizing when the mind is creating unnecessary suffering. You notice when expectations are unrealistic. You observe when fears are based on imagination rather than reality. This clarity creates freedom. When illusions lose their power, the mind becomes less reactive and more stable. You begin moving through life with greater understanding. Challenges still occur, but they no longer feel overwhelming because you see them more clearly. Success still brings joy, but you no longer depend on it as the only source of happiness. Solitude does not remove the complexity of life, but it teaches you how to see through the illusions that once made life more confusing than it truly was. Through awareness, patience, and reflection, the mind begins recognizing reality as it is, rather than as it once imagined it to be. And in that recognition, wisdom quietly begins to grow. 22. Solitude reveals the courage to face your true self. There is a moment that often arrives during deep solitude, when a person begins encountering something that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. It is not an external challenge, nor a problem that needs to be solved in the outside world. It is the simple, yet powerful encounter with the truth of one's own inner self. In everyday life, it is surprisingly easy to avoid this encounter. The world provides endless distractions that keep the mind occupied. Responsibilities, conversations, entertainment, work, and constant information create a steady stream of activity that fills every quiet moment. Because the mind rarely pauses, it rarely turns inward long enough to examine what is truly happening inside. Solitude interrupts this endless movement. When a person steps away from the noise of daily life and spends time alone with their thoughts, something inevitable begins to happen. The mind begins revealing itself. Thoughts that were previously hidden beneath busyness start rising into awareness. Memories return, emotions appear, and questions begin forming that were never given enough attention before. At first, this experience can feel uncomfortable, because the mind is not accustomed to this level of self-observation. Many people initially experience restlessness when they first spend time in solitude. The mind may attempt to escape the silence by generating new distractions. Thoughts may jump rapidly from one topic to another. Unquote. The urge to check a phone, watch something, or fill the silence with activity may appear almost immediately. This reaction happens because the mind has become conditioned to avoid stillness. But if a person remains patient and allows the silence to continue, the mind slowly begins settling. As the initial restlessness fades, deeper layers of awareness begin emerging. This is where solitude begins revealing something profound: the courage to face oneself honestly. Facing your true self does not mean discovering something dramatic or mysterious. Instead, it means observing your thoughts, emotions, motivations, and patterns with sincerity. It means seeing both your strengths and your limitations without exaggeration or denial. Many people avoid this process because it can feel vulnerable. The mind often prefers to maintain comfortable narratives about itself rather than examine those narratives closely. Solitude gently removes the distractions that support those narratives. When you sit quietly with your awareness, you begin noticing aspects of yourself that were previously overlooked. You may recognize fears that influenced certain decisions. You may observe habits that you developed in response to past experiences. You may see how certain beliefs about yourself were formed from moments that happened long ago. This process requires courage because it asks the mind to remain present with what it discovers rather than immediately judging or avoiding it. Buddhist teachings often emphasize the importance of right understanding. According to this philosophy, true wisdom begins when a person sees their inner world clearly without distortion. This clarity cannot develop if the mind constantly avoids uncomfortable truths. Solitude provides the environment where this clarity becomes possible. For example, During reflection, you may notice how often your thoughts revolve around seeking approval from others. Perhaps certain decisions were influenced by the desire to be accepted or admired. Seeing this pattern clearly can feel unsettling at first because it reveals a dependency that was previously hidden. But this awareness is not meant to create shame. Instead, it creates understanding. Once the pattern becomes visible, the mind gains the opportunity to grow beyond it. Solitude also reveals hidden fears. Everyone carries fears within their mind. Some fears are obvious, while others operate quietly beneath the surface. A fear of failure may influence a person to avoid new opportunities. A fear of rejection may cause someone to hide their true opinions. A fear of uncertainty may encourage someone to cling to familiar routines, even when they no longer feel meaningful. These fears often remain invisible in busy environments because the mind rarely slows down enough to observe them. But solitude brings them into awareness. You may begin noticing how certain thoughts create hesitation. You may see how the mind quickly imagines negative outcomes whenever you consider change. These observations can initially feel uncomfortable because they challenge the image you may have had of yourself. However, acknowledging fear is the first step toward overcoming it. When the mind observes fear calmly rather than resisting it, the fear begins losing its intensity. Another aspect of facing your true self is recognizing emotional patterns. Every person develops emotional habits based on past experiences. Some people become quick to anger when they feel misunderstood. Others may withdraw when they feel vulnerable. Some may overthink situations repeatedly, searching for reassurance. These patterns often develop unconsciously, but solitude reveals them. Through quiet observation, you begin seeing how certain situations trigger predictable emotional responses. Instead of blaming external circumstances for these reactions, you begin recognizing the internal patterns behind them. This awareness allows change to begin. Instead of reacting automatically, you become capable of responding with greater understanding. Solitude also reveals hidden strengths. While much of self-observation focuses on challenges or limitations, solitude also highlights qualities that may have gone unnoticed. You may begin recognizing resilience that carried you through difficult moments in life. You may see kindness in the way you treat others, or determination in the way you pursued goals despite obstacles. These strengths often remain unrecognized because the mind tends to focus more on its perceived weaknesses. But solitude allows a balanced perspective to emerge. You begin seeing yourself not as a collection of flaws, but as a complex human being with both challenges and strengths. This balanced awareness creates self-respect. Self-respect grows when you see yourself honestly and accept the full range of your humanity. Another powerful transformation that solitude encourages is responsibility. When you observe your thoughts and behaviors clearly, it becomes difficult to blame circumstances or other people for every difficulty. You begin recognizing the role your own choices and reactions played in shaping certain outcomes. This realization is not about guilt. It is about empowerment. When you accept responsibility for your actions, you also gain the power to change them. Instead of feeling controlled by external events, you begin shaping your future with greater awareness. Solitude strengthens this responsibility because it creates the quiet environment needed for honest reflection. You begin noticing how certain habits affect your well-being. You may see how procrastination created unnecessary stress, or how moments of patience improved relationships. These observations guide future decisions. Instead of repeating unconscious patterns, you begin making choices aligned with deeper understanding. Facing your true self also leads to authenticity. Authenticity means living in alignment with your inner values rather than constantly adjusting yourself to fit external expectations. When you understand yourself clearly, you become less dependent on the approval of others. You begin speaking more honestly. You begin making decisions that reflect your genuine beliefs. This authenticity creates a sense of integrity. Integrity means your actions, thoughts, and values move in the same direction. Solitude strengthens integrity by reminding you of who you are when the world is not watching. Another important outcome of this self-awareness is emotional maturity. When you understand your own mind more deeply, you become more patient with yourself and others. You recognize that everyone is navigating their own internal struggles. Instead of reacting impulsively to conflicts, you approach them with curiosity and understanding. Solitude, therefore, transforms not only your relationship with yourself, but also your relationship with the world. You become calmer, more thoughtful, and more compassionate. Over time, the courage to face your true self becomes one of your greatest sources of strength. You no longer need to hide behind constant distraction or external validation. You know who you are, including your imperfections and your potential. This self-knowledge does not make life easier in every situation, but it makes it clearer. You move through challenges with greater honesty. You approach growth with humility, and you engage with others from a place of authenticity rather than fear. Solitude, therefore, becomes much more than a temporary retreat from noise. It becomes a mirror that reflects your true self. And once you have the courage to look into that mirror with openness and patience, the understanding you gain begins guiding every step of your journey. 23. Solitude reveals the strength of standing alone. There is a powerful transformation that begins to unfold when a person spends enough time in solitude and becomes comfortable with their own presence. At first, being alone can feel unusual or even uncomfortable for many people. Modern life has conditioned the mind to constantly seek connection, stimulation, and validation from the outside world. Phones, conversations, entertainment, and endless information streams create the feeling that being busy and connected at all times is normal. Because of this conditioning, many people unconsciously associate being alone with loneliness or emptiness. However, solitude gradually reveals something very different. When a person remains in solitude long enough to move beyond the initial discomfort, they begin discovering a quiet strength that was always present but rarely noticed. This strength does not come from isolation or from rejecting others. Instead, it comes from realizing that the mind is capable of standing peacefully on its own. For most of their lives, people rely heavily on external feedback to shape their sense of identity. They measure their worth through the reactions of others. Praise may make them feel confident, while criticism may cause them to doubt themselves. Approval can create happiness, while rejection can create deep emotional pain. Because of this dependence, the mind becomes fragile. It feels stable only when external validation is present. Solitude begins loosening this dependence. When you spend time alone and gradually become comfortable with your own awareness, you begin recognizing that your sense of identity does not need to rely entirely on external reactions. You start observing your thoughts, values, and motivations directly rather than through the mirror of other people's opinions. This observation builds self-trust. Self-trust is the quiet confidence that comes from understanding your own mind and believing in your ability to navigate life with awareness. It does not require constant reassurance from others. Instead, it grows through reflection, experience, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. Solitude creates the space where this self-trust can develop. Without the constant influence of other voices, you begin listening to your own inner guidance more carefully. Decisions become less about satisfying expectations and more about aligning with your deeper understanding of what feels meaningful and authentic. This alignment strengthens your ability to stand alone when necessary. Standing alone does not mean rejecting connection or isolating yourself from society. Humans are naturally social beings, and relationships are an important part of life. However, there are moments when following the crowd may lead away from your true values. There may be situations where the majority supports an idea that does not feel right to you. There may be moments when people around you encourage choices that conflict with your deeper understanding. Without inner strength, it can be difficult to remain true to yourself in those moments. The pressure to conform can feel overwhelming. Solitude prepares you for these situations. Through reflection, you become familiar with your own principles. You understand why certain values matter to you and how they shape your perspective. This clarity allows you to stand firmly in your beliefs even when others disagree. Instead of feeling threatened by disagreement, you become comfortable with it. You recognize that different people can hold different perspectives without one perspective needing to erase the other. This calm confidence often surprises people around you. When someone is deeply connected to their own understanding, they do not need to defend themselves aggressively. Their presence carries a quiet stability that communicates strength without confrontation. Solitude also teaches you that standing alone is not the same as being lonely. Loneliness arises when a person feels disconnected from themselves or from meaningful relationships. But solitude often has the opposite effect. When you become comfortable with your own company, loneliness begins losing its power. You realize that your own awareness can be a source of companionship. This realization changes the way you approach relationships. Instead of seeking connection out of fear of being alone, you begin forming relationships from a place of genuine interest and appreciation. You connect with others because you value their presence, not because you feel incomplete without them. This shift creates healthier relationships. When people depend entirely on others for emotional stability, relationships can become strained by expectations and pressure. But when a person has developed inner stability through solitude, they bring balance into their interactions. They can offer support without losing themselves. They can listen without needing to control the outcome. Another important strength that solitude reveals is resilience. Resilience is the ability to remain steady during difficult times. Life inevitably includes moments of uncertainty, disappointment, and change. When a person's sense of identity depends heavily on external conditions, these moments can feel overwhelming. But when someone has developed inner stability through solitude, they approach challenges differently. Instead of immediately reacting with fear or panic, they pause and observe. They ask themselves what can be learned from the situation. They recognize that even difficult experiences are temporary and can contribute to growth. This resilience does not eliminate pain or difficulty, but it prevents those experiences from completely destabilizing the mind. Solitude also encourages independence of thought. In busy social environments, ideas spread quickly. People often adopt opinions simply because they are widely accepted. This phenomenon is sometimes called group thinking, where individuals conform to the beliefs of the majority without examining them deeply. Solitude creates distance from this influence. When you spend time reflecting on your own thoughts, you begin evaluating ideas more carefully. You ask questions rather than accepting assumptions automatically. Does this belief align with my understanding? What evidence supports this idea? What perspective might I be missing? These questions strengthen intellectual independence. Instead of being carried along by the opinions of others, you develop the ability to think clearly for yourself. This independence allows you to contribute more thoughtfully to conversations and decisions. You become someone who brings perspective rather than simply echoing what others say. Another transformation that occurs through solitude is the reduction of fear. Many fears are connected to the possibility of social rejection. People worry about being judged, misunderstood, or excluded if they express themselves honestly. But when you become comfortable with your own presence, the fear of rejection begins losing its intensity. You realize that even if others disagree with you, your sense of identity remains intact. This understanding allows you to speak and act with greater authenticity. You begin sharing your ideas more openly. You pursue interests that genuinely inspire you, rather than only those that appear socially acceptable. Solitude, therefore, becomes a training ground for courage. Each moment of reflection strengthens your connection with your inner voice. Each insight reinforces your confidence in your own understanding. Gradually, the need to constantly follow the crowd begins fading. Instead, you begin walking through life guided by your own awareness. This path does not mean isolating yourself from others. Instead, It allows you to engage with society while maintaining your authenticity. You become capable of cooperating with others without losing your individuality. You can appreciate diverse perspectives while still honoring your own. Over time, this balance creates a powerful presence. People often sense when someone is grounded in their own understanding. Such individuals radiate calm confidence. They do not need to prove themselves loudly. Their stability speaks through their actions. Solitude nurtures this presence. It reminds you that strength does not always appear through dominance or competition. Sometimes, true strength appears through quiet independence, the ability to stand alone when necessary, the courage to follow your own path, and the wisdom to remain connected to yourself even in the middle of a busy world. Through solitude, you discover that standing alone is not a weakness. It is one of the deepest forms of inner strength a person can develop. 24. Solitude teaches you the power of inner stillness. One of the most profound discoveries that emerges from solitude is the power of inner stillness. In the modern world, stillness is often misunderstood. Many people associate stillness with inactivity, boredom, or lack of productivity. Because life is filled with constant movement, people assume that progress must always be loud, fast, and visible. Activity becomes the measure of value. If someone is constantly busy, they appear successful and engaged. If someone slows down, they may feel as though they are falling behind. Yet solitude reveals a deeper truth. Stillness is not the absence of growth. In many ways, it is the beginning of true growth. When the mind is constantly occupied with stimulation, its deeper capacities remain hidden. Thoughts rush past each other without being fully understood. Emotions appear and disappear before the mind can learn from them. Decisions are made quickly, often influenced by pressure or habit. Solitude interrupts this endless momentum. When you step away from constant activity and spend time alone, the mind gradually begins slowing down. At first, the silence may feel unusual because the mind has become accustomed to movement. Thoughts may continue racing as if trying to fill the quiet space. But if you remain patient, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind begins settling. This settling is similar to the way muddy water becomes clear when left undisturbed. When the water is constantly stirred, it remains cloudy and unclear. But when movement stops, the particles gradually sink to the bottom and the water becomes transparent. The same process occurs within the mind. When mental agitation decreases, clarity begins to emerge. Buddhist teachings have long emphasized the importance of stillness for developing wisdom. According to these teachings, the mind naturally possesses clarity and awareness. However, constant distraction prevents this clarity from being recognized. Solitude creates the conditions where stillness becomes possible. In stillness, you begin observing your thoughts without immediately reacting to them. A thought appears, but instead of chasing it or pushing it away, you simply notice it. You notice how it forms. You notice how it changes. You notice how it eventually fades. This observation reveals something important. Thoughts are not permanent. They are movements within awareness. When the mind learns to remain still, it stops being carried away by every thought that appears. This creates a sense of spaciousness. Instead of feeling crowded by endless mental activity, you begin experiencing the quiet space between thoughts. This space is where clarity grows. Stillness also transforms the way you experience emotions. In busy environments, emotions often escalate quickly. A moment of frustration may turn into anger before the mind has time to examine it. A small worry may grow into anxiety because the mind continues feeding it with attention. But in stillness, emotions are observed rather than amplified. When a feeling appears, you become aware of its presence without immediately reacting. You notice the physical sensations connected to it. You observe how it changes over time. This observation reduces the emotional intensity. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by the feeling, you witness it as part of the natural flow of experience. This understanding creates emotional balance. Stillness also reveals the simplicity of the present moment. In everyday life, people often overlook the present, because they are constantly thinking about the past or the future. The mind revisits memories, analyzing what could have been done differently. It imagines possible future outcomes, trying to predict or control what might happen next. This constant movement pulls attention away from the moment that is actually unfolding. Solitude gently returns awareness to the present. When the mind becomes still, you begin noticing details that were previously ignored. The rhythm of your breathing, the quiet sensation of sitting or walking, the subtle sounds in the environment. These experiences may seem ordinary, yet they carry a sense of depth that becomes visible only when the mind is calm. Through stillness, the present moment becomes vivid. You begin recognizing that life is happening here and now, not in the endless stories the mind creates about yesterday or tomorrow. This realization often brings a surprising sense of peace. You see that the present moment does not require perfection to be meaningful. It simply requires attention. Stillness also strengthens concentration. Modern life encourages multitasking and rapid shifts in attention. People often divide their focus between multiple tasks, messages, and conversations at the same time. While this ability may seem efficient, it fragments the mind's attention. As a result, deep concentration becomes rare. Solitude restores this ability. When the mind is not constantly interrupted, it begins rediscovering the ability to focus deeply on a single thought or observation. You may notice that ideas become clearer. Problems that once seemed confusing become easier to understand. Creative insights appear naturally. This focused awareness is one of the mind's greatest strengths. Stillness allows it to flourish. Another transformation that occurs through stillness is the reduction of inner conflict. Many people carry conflicting desires and expectations within their minds. One part of the mind may seek security, while another part seeks adventure. One thought may encourage patience, while another demands immediate results. When the mind is constantly busy, these conflicts remain unresolved. But in stillness, they become visible. You begin noticing the different voices within your thinking. Instead of feeling confused by them, you observe them with curiosity. Over time, this observation helps integrate these conflicting tendencies. The mind begins finding balance. Decisions become clearer because they arise from thoughtful awareness rather than from competing impulses. Stillness also deepens intuition. Intuition is often described as the quiet sense of knowing that arises before logical analysis begins. In noisy environments, this inner guidance is difficult to hear. The mind is too busy reacting to external input. But when the mind becomes still, intuition begins surfacing. You may notice subtle feelings guiding your choices. Certain ideas may resonate with a sense of clarity, while others feel misaligned. This guidance does not replace rational thinking. Instead, it complements it. Together, intuition and reasoning create balanced decision-making. Solitude nurtures both. Stillness also changes the relationship you have with time. In busy environments, time often feels rushed. Days pass quickly, and people feel pressured to accomplish more before the next deadline arrives. But when the mind becomes still, time begins feeling more spacious. Moments feel fuller because you are actually experiencing them rather than thinking about something else. This shift reduces the constant sense of urgency. Life begins unfolding at a more natural rhythm. Another profound effect of stillness is the recognition that peace does not need to be created. It emerges naturally when agitation fades. Just as a lake becomes calm when the wind stops disturbing its surface, the mind becomes peaceful when unnecessary mental activity quiets down. Solitude helps you experience this directly. You begin seeing that peace was never absent. It was simply hidden beneath layers of distraction. Through repeated experiences of stillness, this understanding becomes stable. You no longer need perfect circumstances to feel calm. You know how to return to stillness within your own awareness. This ability becomes a lifelong resource. No matter how busy life becomes, you can reconnect with the quiet center within your mind. Solitude teaches that this center is always present. It does not require isolation from the world. It simply requires moments of stillness. In those moments, the mind returns to its natural clarity. Thoughts settle, emotions balance, awareness expands. And through this stillness, you rediscover the quiet power that has always existed within you. 25. Solitude reveals the path back to a meaningful life. After walking through many layers of solitude, observing thoughts, understanding emotions, discovering inner stillness, and developing awareness, a deeper realization slowly begins to appear. This realization is not simply about peace or calmness. It is about meaning. Many people move through life without ever fully questioning what makes their existence meaningful. They wake up, fulfill responsibilities, solve problems, chase goals, and repeat this cycle day after day. Life becomes a sequence of obligations and achievements, yet beneath the surface, there may remain a quiet feeling of emptiness or uncertainty. This feeling often arises because people are living according to patterns they never consciously chose. Society offers many ready-made definitions of success. People are told what they should achieve, what they should pursue, and what milestones should define their progress. These expectations can be useful in some ways, but they can also lead individuals away from their deeper sense of purpose. Solitude creates the space where these patterns can be examined. When you step away from constant activity and spend time reflecting, the mind begins questioning assumptions that once felt unquestionable. You may begin asking yourself whether the path you are following truly reflects your values. You may notice that some goals you once pursued passionately no longer feel meaningful. This realization does not mean that past efforts were wasted. Instead, it reveals that growth often changes the direction of our understanding. Through solitude, the mind becomes more honest about what truly matters. In everyday life, people often ignore these questions because they feel pressured to continue moving forward. Stopping to reconsider direction can feel uncomfortable. It may create uncertainty about choices that were once taken for granted. But solitude encourages this reflection. In the quiet space of awareness, you begin observing your life from a wider perspective. Instead of focusing only on immediate responsibilities, you consider the larger picture. What kind of person do I want to become? What values do I want to embody? What contributions feel meaningful to me? These questions begin guiding your thinking. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that meaning does not come from accumulating achievements alone. Instead, meaning emerges when actions align with wisdom and compassion. Solitude helps reveal this alignment. You begin noticing that certain activities create a deeper sense of fulfillment than others. Helping someone, creating something meaningful, learning something new, or growing in understanding may bring a quiet satisfaction that external rewards cannot fully provide. Through reflection, the mind begins recognizing these sources of fulfillment. Instead of chasing goals simply because they appear impressive, you begin choosing actions that resonate with your deeper values. This shift transforms the way you approach life. Work becomes more than a way to earn recognition or financial security. It becomes an opportunity to express your abilities and contribute to something meaningful. Relationships become more than social expectations. They become spaces for genuine connection, understanding, and mutual growth. Even simple daily activities begin carrying more significance because they are performed with awareness rather than routine. Solitude also reveals how meaning often grows through learning from experience. Every life contains moments of difficulty and uncertainty. When people focus only on achievements, they may overlook the lessons hidden within challenges. But solitude encourages reflection on these experiences. You begin seeing how certain struggles shaped your understanding. Moments of failure may have taught resilience. Moments of loss may have deepened empathy. Moments of confusion may have inspired deeper curiosity. These insights show that meaning often grows from the process of learning rather than from the achievement of perfect outcomes. Another transformation that occurs through solitude is the shift from external comparison to internal alignment. In busy social environments, people often measure their progress against others. They compare careers, lifestyles, and accomplishments. This comparison can create the illusion that life is a competition where success must be constantly proven. Solitude weakens this illusion. When you spend time alone, the mind becomes less influenced by external benchmarks. You begin evaluating your life based on your own values rather than on societal expectations. This independence allows meaning to emerge more authentically. Instead of asking, "Am I ahead of others?" you begin asking, "Am I living in a way that reflects my understanding of what matters?" This question leads to deeper satisfaction because it focuses on alignment rather than competition. Solitude also reveals the importance of presence in creating meaning. Many people believe that meaning exists only in large achievements or dramatic life events. They imagine that purpose must involve grand accomplishments. But through quiet reflection, the mind begins seeing meaning in smaller moments as well. A thoughtful conversation, a moment of kindness, a period of learning or creativity. These experiences may not appear extraordinary from the outside, but they contribute to a life lived with awareness. Buddhist philosophy often teaches that meaning arises when actions are guided by mindfulness and compassion. Solitude strengthens both qualities. Mindfulness develops when the mind learns to remain present with experience rather than constantly escaping into distraction. Compassion grows when awareness reveals the shared struggles and hopes of human life. Together, these qualities shape a meaningful existence. Solitude also encourages simplicity. When the mind becomes quieter, it begins noticing how much complexity was created by unnecessary desires and expectations. People often accumulate responsibilities and ambitions without examining whether they truly serve their well-being. Reflection allows you to simplify. You may begin focusing on fewer goals that carry deeper meaning rather than chasing countless ambitions that bring only temporary satisfaction. This simplicity creates clarity. With fewer distractions, you can devote your energy to the areas of life that genuinely matter. Another aspect of meaningful living revealed through solitude is authenticity. Authenticity means living in alignment with your inner understanding rather than constantly adapting to external pressure. When you understand your values clearly, your decisions become more intentional. You begin expressing your thoughts more honestly. You pursue interests that genuinely inspire you rather than those that merely impress others. Authenticity brings a sense of coherence to life. Your actions reflect your beliefs. Your goals reflect your values. Your relationships reflect your respect for both yourself and others. This alignment creates inner harmony. Solitude also deepens gratitude. When the mind slows down and observes life carefully, it begins appreciating aspects of existence that were previously overlooked. The presence of supportive people, the opportunity to learn and grow, the simple experience of being alive. Gratitude shifts the mind's focus from what is missing to what is present. This perspective enriches life's meaning because it highlights the value of experiences already unfolding. Over time, the insights gained through solitude begin shaping everyday choices. You become more selective about how you spend your time and energy. You invest in relationships and activities that align with your deeper understanding. You remain open to learning and adapting as life evolves. Meaning becomes less about reaching a final destination and more about living with awareness throughout the journey. Solitude teaches that a meaningful life is not created through constant busyness or endless ambition. It is created through clarity. Clarity about what matters. Clarity about who you are. Clarity about how your actions can reflect the wisdom you have gained through experience. In this way, solitude becomes more than a period of quiet reflection. It becomes a compass that helps guide your life toward purpose and authenticity. Each moment of stillness strengthens your connection with your deeper values. Each insight refines your understanding of what truly matters. And gradually, through this ongoing process of reflection and growth, life begins unfolding with a sense of meaning that no external achievement alone could ever provide. When you step back and look at everything solitude has revealed, you begin to understand that being alone was never about isolation. It was about rediscovery. Throughout life, the noise of the world slowly pulls our attention outward. Responsibilities, expectations, comparisons, and constant stimulation make it easy to forget the quiet center within us. We begin searching for clarity, peace, purpose, and validation in places that were never meant to provide them permanently. Solitude gently brings us back. Through silence and reflection, the mind begins seeing itself more clearly. You learn that you are not your thoughts. You discover the difference between what you truly want and what the world told you to want. You begin healing wounds that distraction could never heal. You build a stronger relationship with yourself and awaken the creativity, awareness, and intuition that were always waiting beneath the noise. As solitude deepens, it reveals something even more powerful. You begin seeing through the illusions of the mind. You learn that peace does not depend on perfect circumstances. You develop the courage to walk your own path, to stand alone when necessary, and to live authentically without constantly seeking approval. Pain becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Compassion grows for both yourself and others. Inner freedom becomes possible because you understand your mind instead of being controlled by it. And eventually, a quiet truth appears. Everything you were searching for in the outside world, peace, clarity, meaning, strength, was always present within your own awareness. Solitude did not create these qualities. It simply removed the noise that was hiding them. This is why spending time alone can be one of the most powerful experiences for the human mind. It is not an escape from life. It is a return to the deepest understanding of life. When you learn to sit quietly with yourself, you realize that you are never truly empty in solitude. Instead, you are finally meeting the most important companion you will ever have, your own awakened mind. And once you discover that inner presence, the world outside no longer feels overwhelming. You move through life with calm, clarity, and purpose, knowing that the peace you were searching for was never somewhere far away. It was always waiting in the silence within you.